Good morning, everybody. Many thanks for accepting our invitation. My name is Ettore Greco. I am the Executive Vice President of this institute, and I am very pleased to open this public seminar on the war in Ukraine and the future of non-proliferation and arms control in Europe. This event is part of a research project which aims to examine first, the far-reaching impact of the war in Ukraine on the security situation in Europe, including in particular long-term implication for the continent's strategic balance. And second, the policies, diplomatic and defense initiatives needed to rebuild a sustainable security system in Europe, based on effective and credible security agreements and measures that can provide adequate guarantees. Let me stress that this project is supported by Italy's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation, with which we have cooperated since the first design, the conception of the project, and then on its implementation, and the Compagnia di San Paolo, which is one of our main strategic partners. The project foresees 3 seminars, each with a different focus. We held the first one in mid-February at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It was devoted to a transatlantic discussion on the future security order in Europe in the aftermath of the Ukraine war, with the participation of experts and diplomats from NATO countries. That seminar, which was also supported by the US Embassy in Rome, in that seminar we looked into the key issues linked to the evolving security situation and the defense policy of individual countries in Europe, such as the changes in the security and defense policy of Germany, so the prospect of the so-called Zeitenwende, Turkey's relations with the EU and US, and Russia's role in Europe's security order. So this was a particularly important seminar because also not only was held at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, but also involve diplomats from many countries. Today's meeting is the second of this series of meetings. This is specifically dedicated to discussing the non-proliferation and arms control dimension of Europe's security system. There will be then a third meeting where we will focus on Italy's role, so its contribution to the efforts that we hope could be undertaken to rebuild a viable and reassuring security order in Europe. Admittedly, discussing what type of arms control arrangements can be established in Europe can seem a little bit premature in view of the fact that actually we don't see a realistic prospect of the war ending anytime soon. Some analysts, as you know, think that it has reached a stalemate, de facto, has become a war of attrition, and the situation is unlikely to change in this regard in the coming months. But others, on the contrary, foresees a more dynamical and even more dramatic evolution. And indeed, we know that the risk of further escalation are not negligible. As we say, Russia could end the war today by simply stopping its aggression and leaving the territories illegally occupied. But the fact is that, as the latest Russian military action also show, this of course won't happen. So no one realistically can imagine even a truce to take place in the short or medium term. Still, I think it's our task as researchers to adopt and also try to promote a far-sighted approach and try to discuss, identify the crucial problem that will have to be addressed in the longer run, including after the end of the war or a more or less stable armistice. And this debate, no doubt, should include the arms control dimension as a fundamental one. It is indeed difficult to imagine any sort of stable security environment in Europe not based on a new set of arms control agreements and measures. This will be, of course, admittedly again, a daunting challenge. The arms control architecture in Europe, the one established after the end of the Cold War, had almost entirely collapsed before Russia's aggression, and in fact, this last aggression, and in fact, some fundamental agreements had become obsolete already in the late 90s. All attempts to revise and update them to take into account the new geopolitical realities had failed, and this was one of the factors which contributed significantly to the deterioration of the relations between the EU, NATO states, and Russia in Europe. This applies in particular to the treaties and agreement regulating conventional armed forces and activities. But even Europe's nuclear order was dealt a heavy blow, we know, from the demise of the INF Treaty. And now the New START, we know, is at serious risk of facing a similar fate. But that said, it should be fairly clear that any outcome of the war will pose difficult and thorny dilemmas on whether or to what extent an attempt should be undertaken to introduce arms control measures as part of a wider post-war deal. This will be, again, a difficult dilemma, also because any arms control agreement would de facto amount, to some extent, to accepting the post-war situation and the legitimate interest of all parties, including Russia. The willingness and capacity of political leadership to do so after such bloody and destructive war is doubtful. In any case, even an armistice will imply the adoption of credible arms control or at least confidence-building measures. That said, it goes without saying that any possible stable new security order in Europe would also require new deterrence postures and new forms of security and defense cooperation with Ukraine. Here comes the problem of the prospect, in case of a Russian defeat, of Ukraine becoming part of a Western security system or even a NATO member. The key point is that, as in the past, there will be a need for a mix of deterrence and arms control. And finding the right mix is a difficult proposition, but one I think that needs to be discussed because it is at the core of any sensible debate about post-war security arrangements in Europe. All these would, of course, require that we discuss to some extent not only the latest military developments, but also the possible outcomes of the war and the types of arms control measures that each of them would require. Today's meeting is divided into two sessions. In the first, we will discuss the nuclear dimension. It will be introduced by Clara Portela, Professor of Political Science at the University of Valencia. And the second session will focus on the conventional arms control, and will be introduced by Hans Joachim Schmidt, Associate Fellow at PRIF in Frankfurt. Both speakers are authors of a paper of which they will present the main points, and this will help, I think, kick off our discussion. And I wish to thank both of them, Clara and Hans, for accepting our invitation. A revised and updated version of the papers, based also on our discussion, will be published by June by the Institute. In addition to the paper givers, the two sessions also features two leading experts who will act as discussants. We have indeed two very qualified panels, and wish to thank all of the panelists for being with us today in person or virtually. So I very much look forward to our debate, which I'm sure will offer many insightful inputs and suggestions. I have now the pleasure to give the floor to Ambassador Trezza, who will chair the first session on nuclear arms control. Please, Ambassador, over to you.
Thank you, Ettore. A few words preliminary. First of all, it's the first time that I come back to IAI after COVID, and I'm very happy to see the new premises of IAI, which are very, very impressive. IAI is becoming more and more active in the field of arms control and non-proliferation and disarmament. And as you probably all know, it has a leading role within the framework of the European Consortium for Non-Proliferation and Disarmament. I'm very happy of this development and of this growing engagement of the Institute in this field. Also, I note that this session has two major sponsors. One is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and the other one is Fondazione Compagnia di San Paolo. I know that it's not easy to find sponsors for arms control activities, much easier for the, let's say, industrial military compound to sponsor activities in this field. I am here to introduce Clara Portela, who is a well-known scholar, and we know her also from the EU consortium. Ettore already mentioned her position right now. Just a few words about her CV. She holds a PhD in European University from the European University Institute in Florence, and a master's from University of Berlin. She's a full-time faculty member of the university in Valencia, having previously served in a similar role in Singapore Management University. She's also a senior associate analyst at the EU Institute for Security Studies in Paris. Quite a record altogether. Now, I confess that I deliberately avoided to read her paper, because I would have been tempted to preempt what she was going to say. Therefore, I'm going to discover it together with you, and I don't want also to steal the show to the two discussants who will make comments on that. Just as a general remark, I would like to say that it is usually accepted that the European Union as such is a major player in the field of non-proliferation, but is a weak player in the field of nuclear disarmament. And the reasons for that are quite understandable, because from the nuclear point of view, be it peaceful, be it military, the EU is I would say, dishomogeneous or inhomogeneous. I don't know what is the exact term in English. And for this reason, it is hard for the EU to express itself in the field of nuclear disarmament. This homogeneity is caused by the fact that until a few years ago, we had in the EU two nuclear weapon states, France and the UK. Now only one, because the UK is no longer in the European Union. But we have also a large number of EU countries which are at the same time members of NATO, and a number of other countries like Austria, like Ireland and others, which have would I say, a neutralistic background. And all this makes the possibility of reaching a consensus much more difficult on nuclear disarmament issues. But I think that there is a trend towards more homogeneity in the future, because first of all, the UK is no longer in the EU, and the UK, I think we all agree, was not a champion of nuclear integration, European integration in this field. At the same time, we have the prospect of two neutralistic countries joining NATO. Probably it will take place, Finland and Sweden. So the trend, I believe, is towards a major homogenization, whatever it is. I think that one of the main events in which this dishomogeneity was took place was the whole process of the negotiation of the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, in which really the European Union was totally divided. There were countries which joined and ratified the treaty, others which said that they would never, ever join it. And I mean, this was, I would say, a kind of sad moment for the European Union. Again, there are prospects, I would say, that this situation might be overcome, and that one day maybe the European Union as a whole will be able to express a common position even in the framework of NATO. That said, I think that I have already said too much. Therefore, I give the floor to Clara. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. So I wonder if it's necessary for me to take the mic a bit closer. Okay. Okay, because I was wondering whether it was possible to hear me without a mic, but okay. Okay. So thank you very much. I would like to start by thanking Ambassador Trezza, but obviously also Dr. Greco for inviting me, and also Manuel Herrera for their kind invitation. And well, I'm very privileged to have the opportunity to give the impulse paper for this our brief discussion today. So the idea was to look at the implications, or let's say the nuclear dimension of the current war in Ukraine following the aggression by Russia, and discuss what the consequences, the impacts are being for European security and what the next steps may be. So first of all, the main consequence of the current conflict that we are witnessing is that there has been, or the main trait, the main characteristic, the most important phenomenon, so to say, is that we have witnessed a number of threats issued by the Russian Federation to actually employ nuclear weapons. So this has been quite a shock in terms of for the European security environment, and it has heightened notably the threat perception of countries in continental Europe. Now, the key purpose of such allusions to the possibility of nuclear use was to prevent direct Western military intervention in Ukraine, obviously. This was particularly obvious because such threats were issued particularly at the beginning of the conflict, and basically they consisted in warning of direct clashes between NATO and Russian forces because they could lead to a nuclear escalation. Other than these more explicit or obvious threats, there have been some more covert allusions or more indirect allusions that have been identified as as being geared towards limiting Western support for Ukraine in general. But in this case, the allusions have been less obvious, and I mean they also take a secondary role in comparison to the others. Now, this behavior that has been described as nuclear saber rattling remains contentious in terms of their effectiveness, because on the one hand, there have been a number of statements by Western officials that alluded to the risk of nuclear escalation when they call for moderation or for limiting the support or being careful or cautious about the military support offered to Ukraine. So this is something that has been interpreted by many analysts as showing that these nuclear threats were actually, or these allusions to possible nuclear use have been successful. But then you also have other observers who claim that such moderation would have taken place anyway, given that there is an absence of security commitment that obliged NATO members or other countries to support Ukraine militarily or even to deploy troops or to mount, basically to provide military support in a more direct way. Now, as far as the general assessment is concerned, well, we can say that there is consensus around the idea that the current conflict has made nuclear weapons use in Europe more likely. And in general, I mean, we see how they have relaxed the possibility of nuclear use compared to the situation before the war, bringing down the threshold, let's say the threshold for nuclear use. What is interesting, probably one of the aspects that are interesting to observe is that despite the fact that from a doctrinal point of view, there are already options contemplated for possible nuclear use that do not necessarily respond to a threat that is directly nuclear related, so there are possibilities contemplated for nuclear use in the absence of a previous or a threatened nuclear attack by the other party. What is interesting to observe is that there have been some references made to the possibility, in the presidential address of 2022, so basically last year, in the presidential address there were some allusions or some references to the possibility that Ukraine could develop a nuclear weapon thanks to the technology that it already had it at its disposal. And there has even been some rumors or some fake news disseminated about the possibility that Sweden was ready to allow the deployment of nuclear weapons on its territory, something that was dismissed by the Swedish Prime Minister shortly afterwards. So, I mean, perhaps the way to interpret this is that despite the fact that doctrinal instruments already cover the option of nuclear use in response to non-nuclear challenges, an attempt is being made on the Russian side to still justify the threat of this nuclear option by trying to create or to refer or to imagine circumstances of purported nuclear danger on the other side. Now, one of the most important consequences of the war and the heightened threat perception that resulted from it is something that has just been alluded to by Ambassador Trezza, the shrinking of neutrality as a security policy on the European continent. So we have clearly witnessed a weakening of neutrality, first and foremost in the application by NATO and, by Finland and Sweden to join NATO. There has also been some reconsideration. There is still some debate underway in Moldova, one of the few neutral countries on the European continent, even though it remains, even though it remains outside the EU sphere. And there has also been some insinuations or some illusions about the implications of neutrality for the behavior of countries like Switzerland and Austria in the context of the war. Although, we cannot go as far as to claim that in places like Switzerland and Austria, neutrality is under threat. But this is definitely the case with Finland and Sweden. The reasons for this change of heart are obviously linked to a dramatic increase for popular support regarding the option of NATO accession. So it became a majority position in Finland, while it was a minority position still before the war among the population. Even though the elites, the political elites in this country, to some extent also in Sweden, but particularly in Finland, have been favorable to the relinquishment of neutrality also prior to the eruption of the war. So in any case, what are the consequences for European security of the abandonment of neutrality by these two, let's say, key neutrals, or these two key countries following a neutrality policy? Well, first of all, the roles that neutrality fulfilled since the end of the Cold War era, or actually already in the Cold War era, have disappeared. So, we can remember that neutrality had this function of avoiding direct borders among countries that could be potential adversaries or that were already rivals. And they also managed to keep the areas in which they were located as low tension areas already during the Cold War. But if we look at the implications for the security landscape, and particularly for the positioning of the EU in the global nuclear complex, we are actually going to lose two key countries in terms of bridge building efforts. So both Finland and particularly Sweden have traditionally acted as bridge builders. And if we look at the positioning of EU members, or they almost entirely overlap with NATO members, but not quite. So if we look at the positioning of EU members in nuclear questions, we can see that there is a big group of NATO members, so countries that are concurrently NATO allies and EU members, that obviously follow the policy of supporting nuclear deterrence as part of the doctrine of the alliance. then you have a number of countries that are quite resolute disarmament advocates and that follow a more abolitionist line. And I mean, here Ireland and Austria stand out, accompanied by countries with a much lower profile, such as Malta or Cyprus. But I mean, basically, the champions of abolitionism continue to be Ireland and Austria. While in the case of Sweden, Sweden used to be much closer to this abolitionist camp, but then it became a bit more moderate and joined Finland in occupying a middle position between the NATO majority and the abolitionist countries. Now, what is interesting when we talk about the nuclear dimension of the conflict is that it is pretty much a precondition to be a neutral country, or at least not to be a member of NATO, in order to be able to fulfill any of these roles. So either a more uncompromising line of abolitionism, in other words, a support for the TPNW, or a middle moderate role that could actually help bridging the divisions between the more pro-nuclear deterrence line and the abolitionist line. So the question is, where is this going to leave the landscape within the EU, and how this is going to affect our relations to the global south and to basically to the rest of the NPT community? So the consequences might actually be rather, well, look like they are going to be rather negative. The very final point, because I see my time is soon going to be up, is obviously also an aspect that already Dr. Greco has mentioned, the suspension of the New START treaty, which was basically the last remnant of the arms control, bilateral nuclear arms control arrangements that we had left after pretty much everything else had been abandoned step by step. So luckily, we are just talking about the suspension. It's not a full cancellation of the treaty, which also, which let's say opens a window of the opportunity for resumption. And let's say it makes it more easily reversible than if it had been completely cancelled. So, I mean, perhaps the hope is not completely gone that this treaty might be revived, and the gesture towards suspension might have been, can be interpreted more as gesturing than anything else. But in any case, moving very quickly to the implications for the EU, first of all, it is quite noticeable that the Brussels institutions have actually taken advantage from this crisis in order to present themselves as capable of security relevant action. So they have started to, I mean, they have started to speak the language of power. They have been able to present themselves as the geopolitical commission that they wanted to be from the start. So, I mean, even though this has been, of course, a very regrettable shock, the institutions have seized the opportunity to enhance their security relevance. But in terms of the nuclear dimension, this doesn't change the general landscape, which is one of polarization. And actually what we are unlikely to witness over the coming years is a trend towards convergence, precisely because we are losing the bridge builders, or let's say the most moderate countries. And both camps, both the pro-nuclear deterrence camp and the pro-abolitionist camp, have interpreted the events in Ukraine and the nuclear dimension, specifically incarnated in the threats of nuclear option, as a corroboration of their existing policies. So for NATO members, the heightened risk of nuclear use shows how nuclear deterrence is more necessary than ever, while for the abolitionists, the lesson to be drawn is that efforts towards abolition should be should be stepped up. But to conclude on a rather positive note, if there is possible to identify anything positive about the current situation, is that a recent survey of popular attitudes in Germany and the Netherlands towards nuclear deterrence has actually shown a decrease in support for abolitionism, so an increase in support for nuclear deterrence and deployment, the continued deployment of US nuclear weapons in these countries. But at the same time, interestingly, there has been also an increase in support for stepping up arms control measures, which could actually be an encouraging sign that this, that there is an opportunity to be seized now in terms of starting, or let's say reviving, arms control efforts. Sorry for speaking too long. Thank you.
Thank you, Clara. I see that despite the fact that I hadn't read your paper, we have more or less come to the same conclusion with regard to possible future developments. Now, without any further ado, I would like to give the floor to Nikolai Sokolov. Brief remarks on his CV. Nikolai Sokolov was born in Moscow, graduated from the Department of the History of Moscow State University, and worked with the famous Institute of US-Canadian Studies in 1987 until 1992. Nikolai worked at the Ministry of Foreign Relations of the USSR, Russian Federation, and participated in START 1 and START 2 and other arms control negotiations, as well as numerous summits and ministerial meetings. I'm sure that we sometimes coincide in the same meeting at that time. Without further ado, I give you the floor, Nikolai. You have 10 minutes to express your views about Clara's presentation. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to participate in this conference. The paper is excellent. I must confess that I had kind of to think long and hard to decide what should I say, because yes, I agreed with a lot that I read in the paper. Yes, and the findings were very, very good and solid. So yes, I will talk about three main kind of points. One is about the role of nuclear weapons in the current war. Second, about a little bit about the future of arms control, and three, I will discuss what's going to happen to the European Union, its role in arms control and deterrence and so forth. Nuclear weapons are actually the central feature of the ongoing war. Well, I think it's pretty clear that in a non-nuclear world, actually, Russia would not have attacked Ukraine in the first place. Because in that case, the United States and NATO would have entered the war, and Russia would have been defeated in a conventional war. Well, of course, generally, the war would have become a much bigger scale event. This means that not only defensive deterrence works, as everyone assumes it does, but offensive deterrence works as well. Basically, nuclear weapons serve as an enabler for the aggression because nuclear weapons do provide, or at least a perceived guarantee from complete defeat. Yes, I'll return to that in a minute. Now, the fact is not actually simply that Russia, also the interesting kind of twist to that quite obvious point is that this is in fact not the first case that a nuclear state has attacked a non-nuclear state. Well, actually, the United States did go to two wars in the Gulf. There was Serbia, there was Libya. The big difference is, in all the previous cases, no one would have interfered or was on the side of these non-nuclear states, not because the United States has got nuclear weapons, but just, well, because the international situation is such that this would have been impossible. Basically, conventional power gives the United States and its allies a dominant role in the world. But of course, there is also opposition to the United States, to the West, that community. The opposition is well known. It's pretty big. It's actually China, but obviously Russia, the entire BRICS. By the way, even India, to a significant extent. So when we have this big systemic conflict in the world, we need to prepare for the future in which nuclear weapons will remain with us for a long time. Well, at least in the foreseeable future, they will. So they will keep actually playing both roles, the defensive deterrence and the offensive deterrence. And I quite honestly fear, I suspect that the ongoing war is just the first in a string of conflicts that we'll likely see in the next 5-10 years. Now, in the early stage of the war, actually, Russia tried to leverage nuclear weapons for one more task, trying to prevent assistance to Ukraine. And that attempt failed, demonstrating that nuclear weapons still have a limited utility. They may be good for deterrence, but they are not usable for less ambitious and more practical missions. So already by the summer of 22, actually Russia switched to standard deterrence language. With a few actually words, also we discussed that the role of nuclear weapons. So with a few words on the risk of nuclear use. So a lot has been said about that, and debate has been all around actually the field. Was at one point it's fashionable to talk that Russia will be using nuclear weapons at any moment, right and left. A few months later, it's fashionable to say that it will never use nuclear weapons. I would say that debate has really not been grounded in sound analysis as a rule. So just a few points I would like to make here. I do not think that we will see nuclear use against Ukraine itself. So nuclear weapons will not be used in a war-fighting role. Nuclear weapons may be used as a result of escalation, perhaps as an intended result. Why? The situation that Russia finds itself today does favor political escalation through small crises. Well, it does favor in the extreme nuclear brinksmanship. But that may get out of hand, yes, and we may end in a situation that no one even wanted to see. Nuclear use will not be sudden. It will be not the bolt out of the blue. There will be signs that things are getting out of hand. NATO will have to make choices. NATO will have first and foremost, I think, be forced to make a choice whether it openly actually enters war with Russia. Or it backs down. So yes, I do see very, very actually risky behavior by Russia in the future, which may end badly. It will not start with actual nuclear use. I think the likely initial step on the nuclear trajectory will be a nuclear test, and Putin actually just a few weeks ago hinted at that. If nuclear use takes place, the target will not be Ukraine, as I said, but it will be in NATO territory, and most likely it's in the territory of one of new members. And the final point is nuclear use is almost certain in case Moscow faces a full-scale defeat involving, for example, unconditional surrender and regime change. One kind of takeout from that is that we do need actually to define the defeat of Russia. Everyone is talking that Russia should be defeated. Yes, I agree. But what exactly does it mean? So far, plenty of European states, the United States as well, have voiced their opinions. These opinions very much actually differ. But there has been no effort to somehow kind of find a consensus. At some point, we'll need actually to do that. So, since nuclear weapons are here to stay, they will need regulation, the same task that existed during the Cold War.
A few minutes more, Nikolai.
I'll probably need 3, I'm sorry. So, we're really going back to the original concept of arms control. Arms control is a tool to reduce the probability of war and to enhance the stability of the strategic balance. So I participated over the last year. I was in multiple discussions within NATO, including the closed door discussions. The interest in arms control is very strong in NATO. But all discussions was about arms control really centered on risk reduction, on basic measures. No one is really now talking, but at least I have not really heard that conversation about going to broad arms control that borders on disarmament. And there are very, very few actually people, as far as I can see, that talk about disarmament. The good point is that NATO is now paying attention to building capacity, to educating actually the new generation of officials who may be taking part in arms control. So yes, that's a good sign, but we need to accept the fact that arms control will be very limited in scope within the coming years. Where does the European Union feature in all that? The trajectory of the European Union has been actually quite, I would say, unexpected. It was a little bit kind of strange even. The European Union is very quickly assuming defense identity. It has become the main vehicle to coordinate and fund assistance to Ukraine. Actually, the United States is doing that really separately. And NATO has actually quite a small role in all that. Now, European Union is also entering the field of defense acquisition. So you the security domain. You see that the European Union was very quickly, very fast entering the security domain. At the same time, the European Union that used to be the channel for a disarmament sentiment or disarmament kind of position for advancement of disarmament is losing that role as well, especially since, yes, it has been noted before, the overlap between NATO and the European Union is increasing. So where does it leave us? Actually, that leaves us in a pretty uncomfortable actually situation where you might see a split between Europe represented by the European Union and the United States. Yes, and NATO as an alliance is actually quite curiously silent. That's not a very good prospect, but we need to be aware of these actual risks. Yes. On the other hand, there is a risk that NATO and European Union will simply converge as a result. And finally, does the European Union have a role in arms control? Actually, no. Well, at least I do not see a serious role in arms control for the European Union. If arms control process does resume, it will be primarily, at least at first, in the bilateral channel between the United States and Russia. Europe will be consulted. Europe will be involved, but that will be going through NATO. The forum where the European Union could play a significant role, the OSCE, is in decline. Yet, if something begins to revive there, once again, it will be with NATO. So European Union will remain in quite an interesting kind of situation, quite active in security domain, but without a major role in arms control. Thank you.
Thank you, Nikolai. Thank you for your presentation. I think that Clara has many issues to raise when she will come back to your presentation. Now, before giving the floor to Francesca Giovannini, I just want to say that for the participants who are online, that due to time constraints, we will only take questions through the chat. So if you can kindly write your possible questions through the chat, as I said. Now I would like to give the floor to Francesca Giovannini. If she's in the United States, I appreciate the fact that she's awake at 3 o'clock a.m. Francesca, we appreciate your effort very much, and welcome to this event. Just a few words about Francesca Giovannini. She's the executive director of the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School Belfer Center. In addition, she's the adjunct associate professor at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. She has also an international, very meaningful background, as she was the strategy and policy officer to the executive secretary of the CTBTO in Vienna, a very interesting position at the time. She's also has served at the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in Boston. It is not in her CV, but I want to mention also that she's a director of ISODARCO, which we happen to coincide very often, and which is an international institute for disarmament and research on conflicts, which takes place in Italy, in Andalo, every year in the month of January. Francesca, welcome, and I give you the floor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Trezza, and good morning to you all. You are absolutely right. When Manuel and Ettore invited me, I said yes, thinking that 9 o'clock was a very civilized hour what I didn't realize it was 9 o'clock in Rome, and for me it was 3 o'clock in the morning. But absolutely delighted to be here. And again, thank you so much for inviting me. I really commend Clara for a great paper. I think it's awfully difficult to write about, drawing lessons from an ongoing war. And I think we all have to be humble to say that we actually don't know how this is going to end. And so the lessons that we think we can draw today might actually change pretty dramatically in the future. But I have to say, I do very much agree with the comments that Nikolai made, and I am absolutely honored to be on the panel with him. I also think that it would be important in the paper to distinguish things that are a continuity from before the Ukraine war and things that have been accelerated or changed because of the Ukraine war. I think at least in the United States, some of the things we are seeing in the current Ukraine war, the centrality of the nuclear weapons role, is something that is an element of continuity. I mean, for the past 10 years, we've said that the global nuclear order was fragmenting, was weakening, that the nuclear doctrine of many nuclear weapon states was becoming more assertive, more aggressive. So I think it would be important to say what are the elements that fundamentally the Ukraine war has brought anew, and what are the elements that the Ukraine war has fundamentally reinforced. Clara, I want to make 3 points on your excellent draft paper, and part I'm going to build on what Nikolai is saying. So I think the very first part of your paper, the question about how this nuclear context has transformed, and particularly the threats of nuclear weapons use, would benefit probably from a highlighting that, in my view, the Ukraine war brought about 2 roles for nuclear weapons. You cite both of them, but you don't necessarily use the terms. One is certainly the question of nuclear deterrence, which is the threat of retaliation, and that has been successful. The idea that through the threats of nuclear weapons use, the Russian Federation has been able to deter potential interference or involvement of NATO and the United States. But I think there was a second role of nuclear weapons, which is also something that Nikolai brought up a little bit, which is the question of nuclear compellence, which in the United States we call more informally as nuclear coercion or nuclear blackmailing. And this one, I agree fundamentally with Nikolai, has fundamentally failed. A nuclear compellence, if you read, for example, Thomas Schelling, intends to use nuclear weapons as a foreign policy instrument in order to change or coerce an adversary to take a specific course of action or to refrain from a course of action. And in that sense, nuclear compellence has completely failed, because one attempt was to stop, in fact, NATO alliance from supporting Ukraine through weapons. And nuclear compellence has demonstrated its inability fundamentally to function in a crisis like Ukraine. But I think it's important we point out these 2 different roles, because nuclear signaling from Ukraine has been interpreted very differently in different contexts. I was, for example, in a track 2 dialogue with the Chinese, and one of their participants said very well, why is the West making this big deal about nuclear threats from Russia? Nuclear threats in the Ukraine context is simply a nuclear deterrence signaling. For the West, this is not so. It's not only nuclear deterrence, it's also nuclear blackmailing and nuclear coercion. And so the lessons learned we are drawing from Ukraine are really different. And it will be very interesting and rather consequential to understand how other nuclear weapon states are actually reading the situation today in Ukraine and what they are actually taking out of this. I also very much agree with Nikolai, and I think you could actually emphasize a little bit this point. You argue on page 2 that the Ukraine war has fundamentally shown the utility of nuclear deterrence, but has also made paradoxically the use of nuclear weapons more likely. And I would say exactly like Nikolai said, actually Ukraine war has revealed both the utility of nuclear deterrence and its catastrophic limitations. One of my good friends from Russia, Alexei Arbatov, said very clearly that, and intended to remind us, particularly to the West, that nuclear deterrence is not a conflict management or a conflict resolution mechanism. So nuclear deterrence right now is holding in Ukraine But nuclear deterrence is not going to provide the off-ramp or exit strategy that will actually bring the conflict to an end. And in that sense, nuclear deterrence reveals its limitations as nuclear weapons themselves. But let me then switch to other 2 points that I think really important. The accession of the Nordic states, particularly Sweden and Finland, to NATO. I think you rightly pointed out that we are now losing a very important voice on nuclear disarmament, which is Sweden. But I think we are also losing a lot of credibility when it comes to nuclear non-proliferation. And the European Union has always valued both roles, nuclear disarmament and nuclear non-proliferation. I think it will be awfully difficult from now on to go to the global south and lecture about nuclear non-proliferation when one of their most important bridge builders actually chose to enter into a nuclear alliance. So we are losing both diversity on nuclear disarmament, but we are also losing credibility when it comes to preaching and advocating for nuclear non-proliferation. Let's also remind that the negative security assurances that were part, in fact, of the package of the Budapest Memorandum, but that should also be part of the global South nuclear weapon states relationships, have also been called into question by the Ukraine war. So the nuclear non-proliferation agenda, in my view, has also been shaken up pretty dramatically in ways that we don't actually know exactly with what consequences. But let me mention 2 other important points about the entrance of the Nordic countries into NATO. I think it is very clear. I was at the Munich Security Conference. I agree with Nikolai, this idea that Russia must lose, that Putin must lose the war. I think we need to start thinking about what is the meaning of victory here. How does it look like exactly? But I think there are 2 other consequences that are really important for the European Union. I think it is very clear that the power center, the gravity of the NATO alliance and the European Union has shifted dramatically towards the north and towards the Baltic states, with very dramatic consequences for NATO unity and European integration. Yes, there is this defense and deter concept, but this will also have important implications for the European Union budget and resource allocation. In order to sustain this integrated deterrence strategy of NATO, the European Union will have to put together an extraordinary overhaul of its defense industry. Let's not kid ourselves. This will not come at any cost for the European integration of the European investments in other resources and in other sectors. So in a way, some of my colleagues said, well, we have finally succeeded in making the European Union a working group of NATO, a subordinate working group of NATO. And there will be important consequences in the reallocation of resources. I think the accession of the Nordic countries into NATO will also make, paradoxically, NATO unity much more difficult moving forward. I think we are preaching the unity of NATO today, but 12 months down the line, I'm not sure that Hungary, Italy, or Turkey will go that along with the policies that are way more hardliner, way more defense-driven than NATO used to be in the past. And let's also remember that the more you add countries with different defense priorities, and the more you will actually have a balkanization of initiatives. One very important one is the very famous European Sky Shield that Germany just launched without any support from 2 major countries like France and Italy, nor Poland. So we need to be very clear about what this means, because when you move the center of gravity close to Russia, this implies a way more defense, a way more deterrence, forward-looking doctrine that will have real repercussions also for the European Union. And finally, as I said, yes, there will be a loss of diversity, and certainly the relation between the global south and the European Union has also already been affected. Partly is this conflict is not considered a major deal for the global south, it's considered a regional conflict. And this has also somehow brought about this hypocrisy from the Western countries, this idea that, well, we didn't care about Yemen, we didn't care about Congo, but all of a sudden we expect the global south to jump through loops in order to support us. I want to finish with the question of arms control that I think is really important. Now, I really agree with Nikolai. I think we should stop talking about the demise of the arms control. I think we need to start thinking about the transformation of arms control in a new nuclear age. And let me mention a couple of things. First of all, I think President Putin did not withdraw from New START, he dissuspended it. And it is a very important and nuanced point that I think is actually a little bit missed in the Western debate. Also, his statement about nuclear testing after having worked for CTBTO for 2 years, look, in my view, that was a pretty standard and reasonable position. It is, if the United States will resume nuclear testing, the Russian Federation will retain the right to resume nuclear testing too. That, by the way, is also the position that the Chinese have. So I didn't find that talk so dramatic to conclude that arms control is over. But I think we are seeing the end of a very specific type of arms control, which is the treaty-based arms control agreements. In that, it is true. And in part is because the political divisions within Western countries, I think the Congress in the United States will have a very hard time passing new treaties. This is true for China and for Russia. But we might see the emergence of new instruments of arms control. For example, more use of strategic dialogue, presidential initiatives, what we call the unilateral reciprocal measures, more dialogues like the Reykjavik summit. So yes, we are seeing the end of a very specific form of arms control, which was important because of verification and inspection mechanisms. And so we will have to do with less reciprocity and less transparency. But the need to control nuclear arsenals, in my view, will remain central to the consideration of both the Russian Federation and the United States. In that, I think two important last points I want to make. It is up to us as analysts and scholars to set a new rationale for arms control. I think for too long we have taken for granted the idea that everyone agrees that we need arms control. And I think that is not true. I think the Trump administration has shown very well that no, it is up to us to make a clear case of why arms control is important today, why it is beneficiary to all. So setting a new rationale for arms control is what is urgently needed today. But most importantly, I think we need to think about a different generation of arms control. In 1980s, Thomas Schelling wrote a very interesting article called What Went Wrong with Arms Control. And Thomas Schelling pointed out that we have a fundamental obsession with counting nuclear warheads. But arms control was never meant to be just the counting of warheads. It was meant to be a much larger approach to diplomacy, risk reduction strategies, diplomatic relationships. And so I think what we need to move into is what we would call behavioral arms control. It's not so much the amount of nuclear warheads that you deploy, but the type of behavior you choose to act upon with your nuclear deterrence and your nuclear arsenal. I think if we make that switch, the Ukraine war will actually help, spearhead a new age of arms control that we should seize upon. Thank you again for your time, and I very much look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Francesca. Especially in your last part, you propose some major evolution in the approach to nuclear and in general to arms control. This is subject to, I think, a very acute debate in the future. Now I would like to open the floor to questions by the participants who are here with us. Yes, there's one. Okay.
Hello, I'm Polina Sinagets, and actually I'm very impressed by the level of discussion here. And I have a question for Nikolai Sokov. Is Nikolai here? I don't know.
I hope so.
I don't see anyone at the screen, so I still hope.
I am here.
Yes, hello Nikolai, I'm happy to see you. And I still have two questions from the previous discussions, which bothers me all the time, and finally I have the opportunity to ask them. So first of all, it is very interesting what you say about the possibility of using of nuclear weapons by Russia. And the main question is, what are the red lines? Because, Russians are always putting red lines, and then it turns out that they're shifting back and back and back and back. But, everyone supposes that there should be some red line, which is a real red line, not the declaratory one. So what is the red line you consider Russia is really, would be really able to start, really, testing or using nuclear weapons. First and second, when you say about the possibility of using nuclear weapons against new NATO members, such as, I don't know, Poland, for example, I mean, why do you ignore the Article 5 and so on? I mean, so really, usually there is the idea that Russia is not really that much inclined to go for the direct confrontation with NATO. And even there is a fact that, for example, Russia has never bombed even the arms transfers coming from NATO to Ukraine, even at the Ukrainian territory, which could be one other step of escalation, but it never happened. Yeah. So it means that Russia is still having some kind of layers of escalation, potentially. So, and I mean, what is the reasoning in telling that it can be done via NATO and via the new NATO members? Thank you.
Do I answer now, or
we'll take another question?
Yes.
And Clara, then if you want also to...
Okay.
Please. Second question.
Thank you. My name is Hans-Achim Schmidt, coming from PRIF, and I have a question to Ms. Giovannini. You mentioned, and I hope you are right, that Russia has only suspended the New START treaty. It has not withdrawn from this treaty. But when I look to the history of Russian behavior to arms control, they also suspended the CFE treaty at the end of 2007. But in 2015, they left the joint consultative group and ended its membership. They suspended now the Vienna document just at the beginning of the war. I do not expect that they will restart it. I hope it, but I do not expect it for several reasons. So I'm not so convinced that we will not see a break-up or a breakdown of the whole of the traditional arms control we have seen. So my question would be why you are still so optimistic? Thank you.
Question?
Alfredo Rizzo, good morning everybody. Thank you very much.
What is your name, sorry?
Alfredo Rizzo from INAP. Good morning everybody, thanks for the invitation. Very interesting, and also my question and my main thoughts regard the role of European Union, obviously, and basically we have seen, I'm a bit provocative, would like to be a little bit provocative, because we have seen so far European Commission, the presidency of the European Commission, very keen, and a high representative for foreign policy, very keen to, in the perspective of an enlargement of the European Union, opening an enlargement process of the European Union towards the Ukraine. On the other side, we didn't hear very much information, we didn't receive much information from the presidency of the European Council, which would have might have a very relevant role in this context. So in the perspective of a tentative or whatever it may be the escalation of this process that has been mentioned, what could be the role of the European Union in this context, while we see the other regional organization or international organization devoted to self-defense, such as NATO, quite keen on the opposite, to increase to increase a little bit the level of confrontation with Russia. In this context, I would see a crucial role for the European Union, with the view of the escalation of these context, of this framework. But I don't see an institutional really an institutional effort in this perspective. I would like to know if there is some more information on that that I don't know, and maybe the public is not aware of. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't see other questions, so I would like to... Is there some? I just read from Paul Ingram a note for Francesca. Francesca's comments were extremely insightful. She referred to the likely stress on NATO unity, likely in the near future, with a change in emphasis. Is there any dynamic that would need Sweden and Finland to demonstrate their commitment to nuclear diplomacy and to propose the new approaches to arms control? Sorry, difficult to read from here. Anyway, I would like to give the floor to the discussants first, and then final word to Clara. So Nikolai first, then Francesca, and then Clara.
Yes, thank you. Very actually good questions. I will not try to address all of them. To Paulina's question, red lines. We can actually learn a lot about red lines or new data about red lines with the nuclear conflicts from this war. We got used kind of to the Cold War situation where the red line was quite obvious. Yes, it's a large-scale attack, right? Well, it's much more actually difficult to define red lines here. In fact, it's only rational to keep the red lines murky, to make the opponents keep guessing. I would say that an even more challenging situation is that, well, you know, when the situation is tense and you don't really want a large-scale war, it is possible that the red line will be missed. So you cross the red line, but you don't know that because the reaction does not come. The other party knows the red line has been crossed, but they are reluctant and hope that, well, maybe it doesn't get any kind of worse. So let's miss it. Yes, and then one more, maybe even small development, then you get the reaction to that. So the situation is uncertain, the situation is unpredictable. I can say that the only red line that is very certain, in my view, is if Russia faces demand for unconditional surrender, regime change, and all things like that. There is some talk mostly in academic kind of circles, but also in some countries, mostly the new NATO members, that Russia should be divided into several kind of states and stuff like that. Well, yes, that's the red line, definitely. So we should be cautious there. Otherwise, it's really hard to tell. Well, it seemed that the provision of tanks would be the red line. Well, it's not. Now Russia says the provision of aircraft is red line, and we don't really know that. To Paulina's point, very, very important actually point that Russia has not even tried to interrupt the delivery of arms. Yes, and I don't know why. in fact, the important, as we contemplate the bombing campaign that Russia began on large scale back in September, resumed 2 nights ago, we also need to contemplate why it has not attacked some categories of targets. It has almost completely left transportation action networks untouched. Yes, and I don't know why. Maybe they keep them for the next stage. What? So there are a lot of actually things that we cannot understand, that we don't know about decision making in Moscow. Yes, it would have been actually very, very logical for Russia, of course, to keep attacking the corridors from Poland to Ukraine, but they have not. So let's see. The possible nuclear use against NATO in Article 5. As I said, such nuclear use may actually result from escalation of a small confrontation. Once again, I don't know whether actually Russia will do that. I don't know. But it would be very rational for Russia to create a series of small confrontations, to be provocative. As I said, that it would be in the interest of Russia to actually force NATO to face the choice, does it enter the conflict or not? Yes, that will be really, really divisive actually for NATO. It will be an extremely hard decision. But such a confrontation, small confrontation, can escalate, yes, and then, yes, we might actually be looking at the crossing of the threshold. So yes, and in case the threshold is crossed, I would say a very limited nuclear use is possible, but as I said already, I do not think that it will just come to strikes. The most likely option is actually nuclear test. Regarding, by the way, Putin's statement, there is absolutely no indication that the United States is preparing to test. Zero, none. So I simply take it as a ritual kind of, figure of speech. Yes, and that the Russian leadership does consider that a possibility. Furthermore, the instruction to maintain sort of and prepare the infrastructure was actually quite meaningless because it's already there. Yes, the test range has been operational since about 2000, and it's ready to be used. Also, yes, and just wanted to emphasize what Francesca actually said about different countries learning different lessons. Yes, that's absolutely vital, and we do need to look very, very closely at how the nuclear component is seen in China and in India as well. Because I do see very serious and perhaps very destabilizing actually developments. Come on. Developments in that domain in the future. So yes, and my dog is always quite excited when I discuss all the nuclear issues and nuclear policies. Yeah.
Thank you. Just a comment on nuclear testing. I think that no news about a possible test by the United States, but in case of testing, it wouldn't be the same thing because Russia is bound by the CTBT treaty, which it ratified. The United States no, so it would be a violation on the part of Russia in any case.
Well, it can suspend.
Suspensions. Francesca, you have the floor.
Yeah, I want to make 3 points. So why am I optimistic about arms control? Optimistic would not necessarily be the term that I choose, but here are a couple of reflections that I take from one of my greatest mentors, Steve Miller, who has spent his life really thinking about arms control. So arms control is not an instrument that you use when you're friends, right? This is an instrument that you use when your adversarial relationship gets even more acute. And I think I agree with Nikolai that we have gone for so many years of discussion and negotiation with the Russian Federation. The Russian Federation has an enormous community of arms control supporters, from the scientific community to the academies of science, to the thinkers, even the practitioners, the policymakers. And so does the United States. So what we see here in both the US and Russia right now are extreme fringes that do not necessarily see the value of arms control, but I think the majority of the communities in both the United States and the Russian Federation has come to that conclusion that arms control is stabilizing for deterrence, it is indispensable, and I think the very core is solid. Now, let me mention that the architecture might be, wobbling, and it started being wobbling, quite frankly, from the failure in 1999 of US Congress to ratify the CTBT. This is where it started going really down the toilet, if you allow me this metaphor, and the withdrawal of the United States from the ABM Treaty and from then on. So that kind of architecture, in my view, is under question. The concept to me is very solid, and let's remember that after the biggest nuclear crisis, the Cuban Missile Crisis, this is where the golden age of arms control really begins, the big thinking about how to reduce risks. So I have no reason to believe that this time is going to be different, that the Russian community of arms controllers will all of a sudden accept that this is it, we have reached the end. I think both the US and the Russian Federation also have a real serious interest in keeping an architecture that is predictable, precisely because we are entering in a nuclear multipolar age. And the transformation, as Nikolai said, in India, in Pakistan, and in China, which in my view right now, we are not really looking at very carefully, right? Because we are distracted with other things, might actually have a serious impact. The new nuclear doctrine of the North Koreans will have major repercussions in East Asia. So arms control is an inevitable instrument. The way in which we'll go about this, in my view, will be very different. And again, we might be uncomfortable with the new generation of arms control, which will be less formalized, less verification, less reciprocal, but might actually really be, again, an access to a dialogue that right now is actually, weakening. Two other points that I think are really important. What is the role of the European Union? So I got quite irritated here in the US about triumphalism about NATO unity. Partly because maybe I'm Italian and I tend to be skeptical about this triumphalism. NATO, the opposite to NATO unity is NATO disintegration. Now, I don't think this is going to be the case, but let's remember that we are celebrating NATO unity during a war, in a time of crisis. The NATO unity will have to measure in a long period of time. The risk for the European Union, in my view, is really to become a mere subordinate, an instrument of support to NATO. Nikolai said something really, really important. In my view, the Europeans have not registered fully that NATO set the defense policy on Ukraine, but it is the European Union that allows, that provides the implementation instrument, the defense industry, the budget, the humanitarian aid to Ukraine. So the risk here is that the European Union policy, the foreign policy, gets literally almost become, identical to the NATO policy. And in that way, in my view, the European Union will lose a very important freedom and autonomy in bargaining, in negotiating with the global South, in being a real bridge builder. How do you make sure that the European Union maintains an agency? I think that is a big question mark that has to be very, very discussed and considered in Brussels. I want to make one final point. I think we are entering into an age where we will have to seriously think about what to do with nuclear sharing and nuclear weapon forward deployment. I say this because in my view, this is just new ground of contestation and discussion that will be open with the Ukraine war, and is already somehow triggering in the Chinese discussions. If you read the statements of China at the NPT, the major deal for them was nuclear sharing, and this gets a little bit confused in the discussion about nuclear proliferation. But I think the age of nuclear sharing and nuclear weapon forward deployment is actually coming. And we need to think about what are the consequences for the equilibrium among nuclear weapon states. I don't think that we will see NATO or in fact the Russian Federation remain the same after the Ukraine war. I think there will be a lot of changes also in the nuclear posture and nuclear force structure. And so what that means for arms control, for the European diplomacy, for European security, I think are important things that we need to talk about right now and start thinking about very seriously. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just on this last sentences by Francesca, I would not put nuclear sharing and nuclear strategy, stationing in the same basket. They probably should be kept separated. Clara, it is your turn to give the final response to these very active discussions that we're having. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I'm going to be very brief in the interest of time because I understand we are already a bit late. So first of all, I would like to thank the discussants for their very rich input. So thanks very much for reading the paper so attentively and for providing so many new ideas. So I hope that I can be back in touch with you bilaterally. And then just very briefly on the couple of questions that referred to the contents that I was talking about. So I see this question from the floor by Mr. Fontana on whether the war on Chinese chips could indirectly become the crossing of a red line, and whether it could generate an escalation where China is forced to arm Russia and therefore indirectly also support a territorial nuclear confrontation in Ukraine in order to win the war. Now, I definitely see that the so-called war on Chinese chips is, bears some risk of escalation, because we have been witnessing already before the war merging, or let's say an increasingly vague separation or a weakening of the separation between economics and defense. So we are actually seeing that a securitization, an increasing securitization of trade issues. This said, I mean, certainly there is a risk of escalation, and there is a risk that this is regarded as an increasingly adversarial move by China, which might push it to support Russia even more in diplomatic and military terms. But I don't see that necessarily having an impact on the likelihood of nuclear use. It would be rather a conventional support of it would translate into a conventional push to the Russian advances. And very quickly, also on the question mentioned by Mr. Alfredo, I didn't catch the surname. I mean, it is true that we are seeing that the Council of the European Union has not been terribly active. Is that what you meant? Okay, the European Council, okay. Yeah, well, basically, the top level. And I mean, I think that this is one of the most conspicuous characteristics. But within the EU, one of the most interesting dynamics has been how the Commission has really seized the opportunity to assert itself as a security-relevant actor. And I mean, this crisis has really provided it with the opportunity to implement its agenda of becoming the geopolitical commission and of speaking the language of power, which is basically what von der Leyen announced already when they took off, when her team took office in December 2019. Nobody knew exactly how this was going to happen, but I think that's something that is very illustrative, is the fact that every new sanctions package that is announced, it is not the responsibility of the High Representative, who is a position that was precisely created in order to combine Council. So it's von der Leyen who first wants to make the announcement, and after she has spelled out the announcement, then she hands over to Josep Borrell so that he can indicate the details. While normally it should be the other way around. It should be the High Representative speaking on behalf of both European Council, well, yeah, basically on behalf of the EU as a whole, without institutional divisions, and then leave it to the Commission as the technical body to make explicit how things. Yeah, so basically that's the way it should be, but actually the von der Leyen or her Commission has actually managed to, they have managed to turn it around.
You can discuss this bilaterally, maybe.
Yeah, certainly.
Detail.
So, thank you. Thanks to you and.
Finished?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So thank you very much. We thank the speaker. Thank you very much. Thank you to the discussant. Very lively. And we come back to this room at 11:10. I'm very sorry, but we are under time constraint, so please be back sharp at 11:10 here. Thank you.
Thanks to all of you for being here, also for the online participants. I'm Manuel Herrera, researcher in the Multilateralism and Global Governance program here at the Istituto Affari Internazionali, and co-responsible of the activities of the EU Non-Proliferation Consortium, jointly with Ettore Greco. This second panel will be devoted basically to try to figure out and to understand the potential future scenarios of conventional arms control in Europe, particularly vis-à-vis the current war in Ukraine and what implication has had the war in Ukraine on this potential control. So I'm not going to enter into details into Dr. Schmidt's paper because I think that I don't want to make any spoiler, and actually he will devote quite a lot of time to explain his arguments, but I already tell you that the way he has framed his arguments in this paper are quite, I think, insightful and quite useful also in order to figure out potential future scenarios about conventional arms controls and the prevention of potential weapons diversion in the European continent. So I will start with the introduction. Dr. Hans-Joachim Schmidt is Associate Fellow at the Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt. He was senior researcher at the same institution from 1982 till 2017. And he obtained his doctoral degree in 2003 at the Johann Wolfgang Goethe University on political science with a dissertation on the changes in conventional arms control from 1989 till 1996. He's also a member of Working Group Just Peace of the German Commission for Justitia et Pax. And his expertise, of course, involved conventional arms control in Europe and also in the Korean Peninsula. So I think that could be quite an interesting comparative study, I would say, about how conventional weapons are controlled in both scenarios. Military confidence building measures in Europe and also in Korea, particularly regarding the six-party talks, the old six-party talks. Also on the Open Skies Convention and of course conventional armed forces and doctrines in general. So without further ado, Dr. Schmidt, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you very much to the organizers of this conference. Is it working? Thank you very much to the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It It is a pleasure for me to be here and to present my arguments for further discussion. And I must admit I have more questions than really credible answers. And with that, I will start. And please excuse me that I will more read than freely speaking, because my English is not the best. So, unfortunately, conventional arms control was not much help in arresting the deterioration in Russian relations towards the Ukraine or NATO, and in preventing Russia's military aggression. Russia already was no longer a member either of the legal binding Treaty on Conventional Arms Forces in Europe, or of the Open Skies Treaty. It left the Conventional Armed Force Treaty in 2015 and the Open Skies Treaty in 2021. Nor did the political binding but outdated Vienna document on confidence and security building measures of 2011, whose implementation was suspended by Russia at the beginning of the war, play a mediating role. The adapted CFE treaty, which should adapt conventional arms control, which happened at the end of the Cold War and mainly limited both alliances to the new security situation in Europe, including also NATO enlargement, I should say that very clearly, and also should provide better measures against an attack of only, well, again, not, well, the CFE treaty was important to prevent attack between alliances. The adapted CFE treaty was important to prevent attacks also against single countries. So it would help Russia to control better the military capabilities of NATO enlargement, the adapted treaty, but it would also help the Ukraine for war prevention because it would create legal measures to check Russian military preparations for war. And if Russia would not allow this, it would give, then the Ukraine would know Russia is preparing a war. But this treaty was not in force. NATO had linked, I should also admit, Russia, Belarus, Ukraine and Kazakhstan have ratified the adapted CFE treaty in the hope that the West would follow. But NATO decided in 2002 that it will link it to the solution of the unregulated territorial conflicts in Moldova and Georgia, and therefore nothing happened. When Russia started its unprovoked and illegal attack, it threatened the NATO alliances with consequences as you have never seen in your entire history, in order to deter direct military support for the Ukraine. Both sides have nevertheless shown certain restraints in their use of weapons and in the general conduct of war, which were previously discussed, in order to control risks of escalation and to avoid direct military confrontation. Whether these restraints will hold is by no means assured. And I will mention here 4 points. In spite of their growing military support for Ukraine, Russia has so far not attacked NATO forces or NATO countries. NATO countries avoid to becoming direct parties in the war. Western countries deliver weapons and ammunition under the partly tacit, partly open restriction that they will be not used against Russian territory as of February 2014. And in order to minimize risk of escalation and maximize alliance cohesion, NATO also works hard to include all 3 nuclear powers as suppliers in the delivery of the individual weapon categories and weapons of them. Currently, for the war, I see currently three major possible outcomes. First, with continued support from Western countries, Ukraine can win the war. Second, Russia wins the war either by installing a pro-Russian government or by conquering the complete Ukraine or large parts of it and annexing most of them then. A third option is a compromise between Russia and Ukraine where Russia still would control parts of Ukrainian territory. All three variants raise the following three questions. How can the war be stopped or ended? What kind of ceasefire regulations might be used as a starting point for further measures? And can confidence and security building measures and conventional arms control be revived? I can here only present some tentative and preliminary suggestions, of course. I start with option one, the Ukraine wins. The declared goal of the Ukrainian government is a complete withdrawal of all Russian troops from its territory. This goal is supported by many politicians in the West. Yet in most cases, they do not define this goal precisely. As the delivery of modern Western weapon system has demonstrated, Ukraine forces are capable of using them to reconquer parts of their territory. Depending on the future levels of this support, the Ukraine may indeed manage to defeat Russia and to liberate all of its territory. This option involves one major political problem on the Western side and one major risk in the interaction with Russia, however. First, there is no consensus between NATO and the Ukraine, not even among NATO countries, how far a potential military victory for the Ukraine should go. Should they end when the borders of March February 22 should be reached as a mistake? Or should it stop when the Ukraine had liberated without Crimea Peninsula, or should the Crimea Peninsula even include it? Second, a complete defeat of its forces on the ground contains the risk of a Russian escalation in its war against Ukraine's infrastructure or other military means, including the use of tactical nuclear weapons. And because of the non-nuclear asymmetry between Russia and Ukraine, Russia could continue to attack the Ukraine with long-range weapon systems or irregular forces, even when both sides say they want to end the war. What could this option mean for conventional arms control? Western countries could try to limit weapon holdings of Russian forces close to their holdings at the ceasefire. But it would be not very likely that Russia would accept such an approach. Option two, Russia wins. Russia has more stocks, ammunitions and weapons and manpower resources than the Ukraine and can continue the war for at least 2 or 3 years. In the United States, public support for assistance to the Ukraine has already decreased from 60 to 49%. And in other Western countries, it is also weakening. Republican presidential candidate has announced, Donald Trump has announced, he would end the war in one day, and his rival Ron DeSantis has indicated a reduction in the assistance for the Ukraine. European countries are facing other difficulties. They can only continue the military support for the Ukraine by weakening their own defense now. In addition, Putin may hope that growing social costs of Western sanctions and increasing numbers of Ukrainian refugees will strengthen nationalistic forces in Europe and thus strain the unity of NATO and also the EU. At the first glance, it may seem that a ceasefire would be not necessary for this option because Ukraine would no longer exist and NATO countries had not been direct parties in the war. A number of European states probably would recognize the results, would not recognize, not a number, but most of the European states would probably not recognize the results of the war. However, and might support irregular forces or use other means in order to raise the costs for the occupier. What could this option mean for conventional arms control? It is highly unlikely that the West were to agree to Russian attempts as using arms control in order to ratify the results of its military aggression or to accept its new imperialistic security approach. Option 2 would be the worst case for NATO, also because of the more general consequences. It would demonstrate that a nuclear weapon state could use its nuclear deterrence against a non-nuclear country offensively. It would also increase insecurity for post-Soviet states like Georgia or Moldova, and for NATO states such as the Baltic states, Poland, Slovakia, and others. A renewed and intensified arms race between Russia and NATO would be very likely. With that, I will come to my last option. Compromise, no side wins the war. This is not the option which both sides prefer, but it may be the most likely outcome of the war. Russia may not be able to win the war as long as Western countries support the Ukraine with sufficient weapons and ammunition. And the Ukraine may not be able to win because the risk of escalation are higher for itself than for Russia. As for now, the important Western supporters seem to be willing to support a meaningful defense for the Ukraine, but not the complete win option, despite their phrase, the Ukraine must decide about it. The compromise option means that Russia still controls certain parts of Ukraine territory, perhaps the Crimea Peninsula together with parts of Donetsk and Luhansk, or greater or smaller. This outcome would probably be perceived more likely a defeat for Russia than for the Ukraine and could have consequences for Putin's regime. But it also would not by itself solve the underlying political conflicts. Security, as well as territorial ambitions, systematic threats, and the democratic virus versus the totalitarian reactions. It would be a major challenge for negotiations about a lasting peace and ceasefire agreement. A Minsk-like agreement alone would certainly not be enough because this had not prevented the war in the first place. Thus, option 3 raises a number of serious questions. How to satisfy the different demands from both sides for credible and stable security guarantees which would be strong enough and adequate to prevent the next war about the same issues. How to solve the contested status of the Ukraine between neutrality versus NATO membership. How to manage the problem that Russia has illegally annexed parts of Ukrainian territory. Who should observe the ceasefire? Should BRIC states participate in such a mission and also other neutral states, for example, Switzerland? How to deal with war crimes and reparations, and these only a few questions which should be answered. In substance, any agreement would have to be asymmetrically in Ukraine's favor, since it is the victim of an expansionist war of aggression. But how could it be asymmetrically when the power which has to make the concessions, Russia, has not convincingly lost the war? Under such auspices, the chances for arms control or confidence-building measures will remain limited to very small regional measures to stabilize the ceasefire. Even such small measures would need more personnel and equipment and much more legitimate power for controls on the ground that had been provided for the OSCE in the eastern Ukraine before the war. With that, I will come to my short concluding remarks. The future of conventional arms control in Europe looks dim for all three options. Without a change in Russia's expansionist approach, nothing can and will happen in this area. Maybe some strategic dialogue, but not more. A more or less complete breakdown of conventional arms control and strategic nuclear arms control seems very likely now. And a serious moderation in Russia's foreign policy may take many years. There is one exception for conventional arms control in Europe, and this is the Florence Agreement, or the sub-regional arms control agreement for Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Montenegro from the year 1996, which is still working, besides the war. On the other hand, the war clearly demonstrates the necessity of European conventional arms control because nuclear deterrence alone was unable to prevent this war. And we should keep in mind that nuclear and conventional deterrence alone are not sufficient for crisis stability and war prevention. At the same time, we will face a much longer NATO-Russia border and a strong build-up of forces and much more military activities there for the next years. This development can harden the conflict and increase the risk for European security and stability for many years. Under such circumstances, it would be necessary to establish as soon as possible first risk reduction measures at the common borders between Russia and NATO countries. Either a new arms control forum or the informal structured dialogue could be used for this purpose. And NATO's new strategic concept of June 2022 reduces, of course, the role of arms control under the present circumstances, but it keeps open the door for it, and it should do so in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Schmidt. Following up with our discussants, first we will have Niels Duque. Thanks for coming. Niels is director of the Flemish Peace Institute. He has been working there since 2006 and has authored more than 50 policy-oriented and academic publications on illicit firearms trafficking and gun violence in Europe, domestic gun policies and European arms export controls. So I think that maybe here will come up the debate or the discussion of potential arms diversion in the context of Ukraine. He is also coordinator of Divert and the Project Target, two large-scale European research projects on the diversion of firearms into the legal domain and on the linkages between illicit gun trafficking and gun violence in Europe. So, Niels, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. First of all, thank you, Manuel and his colleagues, for inviting me here today. I think it's a very interesting and a very timely topic to talk about the linkages between war in Ukraine on the one hand and the future of non-proliferation arms control in Europe on the other hand. In times of war, I think it's very crucial to talk about peace and to try to see how we can contribute to roads to peace. And I think arms control and non-proliferation efforts are a crucial endeavor, a crucial aspect in that endeavor. Let me start by saying that I think the war in Ukraine did not come unexpectedly. If you look at the last 10, 15 years, you see a gradual erosion of the whole conventional arms control regime landscape in Europe, which was meant to avoid such conflict. Well, if there's an erosion of such a landscape, we shouldn't be surprised that there is a conflict. So I think that's a very important first point to take with me. And then I think it's also very interesting when reading Mr. Schmidt's paper, it's a very interesting thought experiment to look at the different possibilities in these three different scenarios that he just outlined. What I would like to do today in my contribution to this debate is maybe look at how three conventional arms dynamics relate to peace, both contributing to peace but also maybe spoiling peace. But let me start by looking at 3 scenarios that Mr. Smith described, which are not, I think, all equally likely to happen, as you mentioned in your paper as well. Let me start with scenario 2, Russia wins the war. I think this was a real possibility in the early phase of the war, but Western support, including conventional arms deliveries, have made sure that that is not an option right now. I cannot forecast the future, but right now this does not seem a very likely position, because there seems to be too much at stake now for the Western world as well. Only if Ukraine would go beyond what is now expected and, for example, attacking Russia on its own territory, there might be a change in how the West reacts, but the Western support, I think, for the Ukraine effort is strong and will remain strong. And therefore, a Russian clear win, I don't really see that immediately as a likely outcome. A Ukrainian clear win, I don't think is very likely either. I think that would only be possible if the West wants this and commits to this. And of course, this would require huge resources. This would entail increased escalation risks. It would also have the risk of what you call the collapse within Russia itself, of the Putin regime, which of course would then of course create more risks for proliferation and use of arms and various types of arms. So the question is, does the Western international community actually want Ukraine to win the war? And if you look at the current state of arms deliveries, this is not the case. The arms deliveries at the moment are not there to win the war, they're there not to lose the war, which is a very important difference. So the most likely scenario, in my humble opinion, would be a political compromise, although at the moment this seems very, very far away, but it's probably the most likely scenario. Of course, it's a very wide scenario. There are various ways in which you can find a compromise. But on the good side, this would also be the most likely scenario for a positive, renewed conventional arms control regime. I think in the 2 other scenarios, we will see a clear deterioration. If Russia wins, this will definitely be a push for their imperialistic ambitions. I do not see them as on the demand side of asking for conventional arms control. If Ukraine wins, there's a high chance that the hardliners in Moscow will take over as well, which will probably not lead to conventional arms control demand from their side either. What we will probably see is an arms race, military buildup on 2 sides, maybe even the support of paramilitaries and so on. We're going to work towards a Cold War scenario with all the risks that involves that scenario. So let me come to the 3 dynamics of weapons, of conventional weapons. The first one is about the arms deliveries. I do not think the West is really divided about arms deliveries to Ukraine in itself. The discussion there is more about the extent and the specific types that we're delivering. And of course, that discussion is based on a whole, how should I say that, an observation of possible escalation risks which are involved with various types of deliveries. But the arms deliveries can, and this is maybe my first quote, and this might sound strange from somebody who works for a peace institute, but I think the conventional arms deliveries right now from the West can actually contribute to peace. They can actually contribute to peace because they can help build a better negotiation position for Ukraine. But what we need, I think, when you look at arms deliveries, you need a common objective and a common strategy, which is not the case right now, I would argue. What we see now is an incremental involvement pushing the line without a clear strategy in advance. So I think that is a crucial one. The West should have a clear strategy and cohesive objective. What is very important in the arms deliveries, which is not very much highlighted in the press, but it is, I think, very important, is the agreements that are made with Ukraine about the use of these weapons. You mentioned it a little bit, you cannot reach Russian territory. There are other types of agreements that you're making about the use of these weapons, the transfer of these weapons within your various units and so on. These agreements, I think, are crucial for the Western support. If Ukraine would break those agreements, which they will probably not do because it's their lifeline, that would change the situation. So I think that's very important that we keep having these agreements and we have this objective of supporting with weapons for negotiations. Is to strengthen Ukraine's position at the negotiation table, sooner the better. The second dynamic is arms control. I think arms control is essential, is crucial for sustaining peace. If we go towards the most likely scenario, the compromise, this will very likely also involve a peace for land approach that would require strong security agreements, guarantees, which would also include limitations on conventional arms issues. I think that would be very much a bilateral effort in first, Ukraine and Russia, but of course it will also have a bigger implication because this will also lead to, hopefully, negotiations on a larger security architecture within Europe in which conventional arms control, it will be a crucial element. So delivering weapons could contribute to peace, but if you really want to sustain peace, you need arms control. It's the only way forward. Which brings me to the third dynamic, which is the proliferation of weapons. This is also part of the theme of today, but it's something that's often forgotten. What is the risk that these weapons will end up in the wrong hands? When we talk about the large, sophisticated equipment and large weapon systems, the risk is quite small. We're not talking about, rebel groups taking over large missile systems. That doesn't work like that. It requires training, it requires all kinds of issues. Where is the risk? It's with so-called small arms and light weapons. Machine guns, anti-tank weaponry, that kind of stuff. We know from previous conflicts that these weapons are easy to disappear. They're small, relatively small, they're easy to conceal, they're easy to traffic, they're easy to use, they're very durable. And this is, I think, where the risk is. And I think most of us have seen the footage from Ukraine as well, where crates of machine guns were handed over to people in villages to protect their village, which is a very normal thing to do. But we also know that some of these weapons will disappear. How many? We don't know. But if we look at what happened in former Yugoslavia, I think we can have an idea of the problem. I'm not going to compare it completely because it's a different situation, but the war in former Yugoslavia is now done for the last 20 years. We're still dealing with the legacy of this. What happens when we're talking about criminal gun violence in various parts of Europe, it's being fought with conflict legacy weapons from that period. A firearm is durable for more than 100 years if you keep it a bit maintained. Terrorist attacks in Paris and other parts of Europe have been committed with these weapons. Just to give you an idea of the risk. So the Ukraine situation right now already poses a lot of risks. We analyzed the proliferation of small arms and light weapons in 2017, 2018, after the Crimea war, and that was a huge risk already. At the moment, there are more weapons out there and less control. It's a huge risk. Does that mean we cannot contribute in arms deliveries? That doesn't exclude each other. We just have to be aware of the risk already. I think that's a very important one. What happened is, after Yugoslavia, those weapons, of course, didn't disappear immediately. It took a couple of years before these weapons would end up in the wrong hands and would be trafficked to other parts in Europe. We can likely see a same scenario in Ukraine. If tomorrow the war would end, the people from Ukraine who now have possessed these weapons, they will not hand them over because they fear the Russians will come back. It will take years and they will keep them. But after a while, in Yugoslavia, it took about 10 years, these weapons start to disappear. So it's a security risk for all of us, but I think, and this is what I really want to highlight, it's also very much a security risk and a risk to peace in Ukraine itself. Because those weapons that are out there, every group, every individual who does not feel acknowledged in a peace process can literally use these weapons to literally explode the peace process. It can spoil the peace process immediately. So we should already take mitigating measures today to try to limit the risks of this diversion of weapons. And this is, of course, very difficult. So while under certain conditions arms deliveries can contribute to peace, the proliferation of these weapons can spoil the peace process, but arms control will be crucial in finding a peaceful, sustainable, peaceful solution. And we shouldn't wait. It's not because the war is going on that we should wait. We should do that right now. And with that, I would like to end.
Many thanks, Niels. That was quite a wonderful statement and quite a wonderful intervention. I fully support you and I fully agree with your point of view on this matter. So last but not least, we will have our other discussant, which is Polina Sinovets, founder and head of the Odessa Center for Non-Proliferation, also the Odessa Mechnikov, National University in Ukraine. In her role, she leads the education, training, research, and outreach activity of the Odessa Center, and she is the author and co-author of multiple publications on nuclear weapons policy of the United States and Russia, nuclear deterrence and strategic stability, and of course European security. Although an expert in nuclear weapons and nuclear non-proliferation and arms control, she also has a quite general and quite deep knowledge about what are the current dynamics in the war in Ukraine vis-a-vis the weapons deliveries and conventional arms control. And so we are also very happy to have her here to speak in this panel on this issue, even though it deviates a little bit from her expertise. So many thanks, Paulina, and I will hand on my.
Thank you very much, Manuel. Thank you very much, Dr. Greco. Of course, well, first of all, I'm an expert mostly in nuclear weapons. However, I'm also from Ukraine, which probably makes me much more involved than anybody else here. Maybe let me make one remark, which is not anyhow intended to offend anyone here, but at least if you speak to Ukrainian experts or Ukrainian politicians or whoever coming from Ukraine, calling this war in Ukraine will be a terrible offense, because it's war not in Ukraine, this is war against Ukraine. And this is very important, because this is not a civil war. This is the aggression against the independent state. And this is a consistent aggression till 2014. This is why, you know, I would like to avoid interpreting this conflict as, like, you know, Arab-Israeli conflict or whatever. I mean, this is not something which is, I mean, this is happening in one state, not because of somebody in this state does not agree with the consistency or integrity of the Ukrainian state. This is just because the other state interfered, sent their troops, and systematically tried to annex and keeps trying to annex territories. So coming back to Dr. Smith's paper, I like it very much, not because, you know, these scenarios, pure scenarios, look that much likely, but because they give the certain theoretical framework on the tendencies which can happen within this conflict and the outcomes of these tendencies. So, of course, well, again, we can't avoid the structure, because the structure was drafted perfectly, these three scenarios, which was outlined by Dr. Schmidt. So first of all, of course, the victory of Ukraine. Again, the question is, what is the meaning of victory for each of the sides now? Because if we can define two types of you know, victory for Ukraine. The first type is the liberation of the territories which were annexed after the 24th of February, which is the primary goal, I think. However, if we look at the official Ukrainian declarations, we'll see that there is nothing about just taking over that annexed territories. This is about liberating the whole territory of Ukraine, coming to the borders of 1991, when the Soviet Union broke up. And of course, again, I agree with Dr. Schmidt, it causes certain concerns because of the consequences of these actions. The first concern is certainly that at some point, to what extent, so what are the Russians' red lines, and which I asked Dr. Sokov, of course. And here, you know, I also was thinking a lot about this issue. Of course, so the question when Russia starts, you know, acting decisively, not like when the nuclear threat can become quite real. On my point of view, it will really, I also agree with Dr. Sokov, it really be related to the moment when the legacy of Putin regime would be under threat. And it could come in case if Ukraine will be close to the liberation of Crimea, because as you know that the annexation of Crimea was presented as a great advantage by Putin's regime. It was supported by almost 80% of Russian population. And therefore, So Putin was presented as the second Peter the Great, the one who is united Russia, the new gathering of land, making Russia great again. So he feels himself great just because he has done that. Also, the question number 2, how about the Donbass? Because the so-called special operation against Ukraine, the official pretext was the liberation of the so-called People Republic of Donetsk and Lugansk. And therefore, if those People Republics of Donetsk and Lugansk will not be liberated, Putin will be a clear loser in the war. So for now, I can't imagine Putin presented himself for the Russian nation as a loser in this war. So there can be 2 options. Either he will present this defeat as the defeat from the side of the whole NATO, so saying that the whole world has just fought against Russia in the territory of Ukraine. No Ukrainians, but all NATO soldiers are there, but it's the official rhetorics. And therefore, okay, we had to step back. Otherwise, he would try to escalate, and first of all, I also agree with Dr. Sokov that Putin was using this idea of renewal of nuclear tests not in vain, because this is the option where he could theoretically safely escalate. Because there was some, on my consideration, there was some threat of at least the possibility of escalation in the autumn of last year when Putin declared the official annexation of part of the territory of Ukraine, saying that now they are coming under the provision of Russian nuclear doctrine, so they can escalate if somebody is threatening their territorial integrity. And at that point, the United States increased the serious pressure on Russia, saying that any kind of nuclear use against Ukraine would be retaliated with a conventional strike. Against China and India expressed the serious concern and dissatisfaction with this threat. And there were some, the range of official declarations from the side of Putin and the MFA, saying that they have never planned to do this, this is not effective, they won't be rational, they won't be effective, they won't be practical. And that's true because as far as the border line and the troops line is very long, then using nuclear weapons, I mean, there should be not 1, 2, 3 nuclear bombs, just like, dozens of nuclear explosions along the line of, along the border of Russia, which would never make Russia, feeling better and Russian people feeling better, which will be unprecedented catastrophe in the history of humankind. And of course, Russia is not ready for that. So theoretically, Russia is not really ready for using nuclear weapons against Ukraine. I also doubt that the possibility of using nuclear weapons against part of NATO is high. So therefore, nuclear tests can be a way of showing serious of Russia's intentions. However, what will come from this? Again, this is a big question whether it will work, because as my personal observation shows, Russian nuclear threats can affect whoever, including all NATO, but not Ukraine, because the coercion of nuclear states against non-nuclear states is not working. Nuclear deterrence is not working against non-nuclear states. That is why I don't think it can stop Ukraine in taking over the territories. So what I would like to say that this situation when Ukraine completely wins and takes over territories, I think that, in this situation, the West, of course, would try to restrain Ukraine from this kind of decisive steps, and this is not totally likely. But at the same time, the likeliness of this scenario can be increased in case of the regime change in Russia. Not some kind of forceful regime change from the side of the West. I think it can happen some kind of naturally within these kind of Russia's interactions between the internal actors. And then the new regime can say that it's not our fault, it was, or the all blame is on Putin, and therefore we can have some kind of compromise. And in this regard, I think it opens very good perspectives for the conventional arms control, nuclear arms control, and all new limitations and the renewal of all documents suspended and cancelled, including Vienna document, including the conventional forces, Treaty on Conventional Forces in Europe document. And others because the new Russia would be very interested in renewing the dialogue, and the arms control is the best way how Russia can be a full-fledged partner in the negotiation table and therefore restore its position as a partner, while the West, of course, also will be interested in restraining Russia's positions. And here, some kind of compromise can be found in like guaranteeing each other non-aggression in the future, I would say. But this is the most optimistic scenario, of course. Again, the victory of Russia, I don't, again, what is the victory of Russia now? So the scenario number 2. I don't really believe in the possibility of conquering over Ukraine. It's not possible because, maybe, Russia was considering, and probably it could be possible really in the beginning of the war. However, the strong resistance of Ukraine showed that it's not clearly likely. So the only thing we can foresee, the worst case scenario, is probably, I don't know, going further along the Black Sea line and taking over some other cities. But what is more likely is to retain the already annexed territories. I don't think that they really hope for more now. Of course, they can proclaim any other aims, but for now they are not having bigger ambitions. However, of course, we should never relax because, again, as Dr. Schmidt justly noticed, in 2024 it will be the elections in the United States. If the administration changes, there can be some changing in the weapons support of Ukraine. And knowing Russia's strategy and its strategic patience, we can expect that they are waiting and they will protract this war till 2024 to wait for this window of opportunity which can appear in case if this support from the West will be diminished. And in this case, they can, go on pressuring. I don't think that, I think that by that time, of course, Ukraine will have much more weapons than it has now, and Russia would not reach that kind of final maximum goals. However, it can still steadily retain the territories which it has taken over, and even maybe take over maybe like the other parts like Kherson and Zaporizhia, because for now, they have taken just part of Kherson, part of Zaporizhia, and maybe taking the whole Donbass, but this is the worst case scenario. So in this situation, of course, this will be the worst, again, agree with Dr. Schmidt's scenario, the worst example for China, North Korea, and Iran on how nuclear weapons can help you to reach your expansionist goals without any kind of direct interference from the other states, from the international community. And of course, in this case, the arms control, any arms control would be buried because the West would be seriously preparing for fighting with Russia, who is, moving forward. And Russia would be seriously preparing for fighting with the West, understanding that, the arms race is rising. So now we are coming to the most likely scenario where both sides should reach some compromise. But the biggest question is what compromise can be reached. For now, none of the sides is ready for compromise, for any compromise. Putin is full of hopes that at some point the West would stop or diminish the support of Ukraine. Ukraine has a great hope for receiving the aircrafts and other kinds of weapons and for moving forward and for taking over all the territories which belongs to, according to the law. So no possibility of going to the negotiations table at the moment. And plus, there is a very strong belief in Ukraine, and I don't think that it's just a subjective belief, that if we'll sign a peace agreement with Russia now, it will be not the end of the war. It will be just a break for Russia to understand its strategic mistake, to rebuild its army, to become stronger, and to go on further. And in 5 years, and in 2 years, Russia's war on Ukraine, over Ukraine, and taking over Ukraine can be ended with just the end of Ukraine. So this is existential now, not to stop the war, since Russia is already a bit exhausted, a bit out of the resources, and since we can take over some territories. So, and of course, this scenario is, so at some point, probably both sides will have to go to the table talk. But again, the question is, what is this delimitation line, the new border? Because of course Ukraine would be, very interested to take back the south, which is important for Russia because this part of the Kherson Oblast is the part where water supplies are coming. Again, the question about Donbass, to what part of Donbass Ukraine would be able to give up, or it won't be able to give up at all. Again, the question of Crimea, I can't imagine how it can be closed by Ukraine. So again, any kind of ceasefire agreement will be built up on the mutual dissatisfaction of the sides, and this mutual dissatisfaction will give a very stable ground for the growing arms race and for the preparing of the new war. And again, none of the possibilities, I can't foresee any possibilities for arms control conventional, first of all, in the region. So yeah, these are my not very optimistic perspective of the situation. Yeah, thank you very much, and yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Paulina. I mean, not very optimistic, but at least very based on the groundwork. So we actually know what's going on there. So we are gonna open now the session for Q&A. First of all, we are gonna collect the questions from people here in the room. But also, I will be thankful if technical support is able to show me the question from the online participants. Well, I mean, we can do that in the conclusion of the. Sure. Okay. So, any questions on the floor? Yes. Okay. We have 3 in the main row. First for Ed.
So I have a question, especially to Paulina. So your intervention was very insightful and enlightening, also because you discuss some intermediate scenarios which should be considered. And I remember at the beginning of the war, in the first days where Russia was on the offensive, that President Zelensky said that he would be in favor of some sort of truce or armistice if the Kremlin stopped, of course, its offensive and returned its troops to the position before the beginning of the offensive, first, and start negotiation again. And second, that the question of Crimea could be kept outside negotiations or for a later stage. So that will be not a theme of the negotiation, the subject of negotiation. Then a lot of change, of course, including the final decision of Russia to annex the 4 provinces, which of course has enormously complicated and even made it very unlikely the prospect of negotiating solution. But still we are considering this intermediate solution. In case there is some progress for Ukraine on the ground, do you think that this position could be revived? So the idea that at a certain point, Zelensky and the leaders also, of course, at the urging of Western leaders, will certainly happen in this scenario, would accept and consider to come back to this position, which will be at that moment realistic or reasonable, and also pay the political price, be able to, in any case, accept the costs in political terms of this possible way out. So at least an attempt at stabilizing the situation after some type of armistice or truce.
My name is Stefano Silvestri. The question, I think that it is rather too early to consider the possibilities of compromise. We have to see how the war will develop, in fact. And the decisions is not, there is not yet really a problem of defining a line. The line will be defined later, when the battle will have finished at least next spring, possibly, or possibly next summer, hopefully. Not necessarily, but hopefully next summer we'll know better how the situation will be. So I don't think that we can consider possibilities of compromise, also of armistice or a possibility of dividing lines. Seems to be too complicated to decide now and too theoretical. I think that in this perspective, the possibility of arms control is limited and should rely mostly on unilateral restraints more than multilateral or negotiated agreements, because negotiated agreements possibly will be very difficult. What is going on is that for the moment, Russia has discovered that the nuclear weapons are not so useful for the war, and so is not using it. And for the moment, NATO has avoided, has tried, or the Western allies of the Ukraine are trying to convince Ukraine not to attack too deep into Russia, not to counterattack into Russia too much, to stay near the borders, let's say. This is unilateral restraint. How can go on this situation? I doubt that we can really theorize. I think that this kind of unilateral restraints are, of course, fragile. They could change given the situation. Is there a possibility of something more? Is it possible to take again, to consider again confidence-building measures, at least in two areas which seems to me not necessarily immediately related to the conflict, like the Baltic Sea and possibly the Black Sea, not as far as Crimea is concerned, but the rest of the Black Sea, because in both cases, I see a high possibility of accidents which may go very wrongly, and more probably in the Baltic, but also in the Black Sea, but also in the past has been not so quiet. And of course, the position of Turkey today could be discussed, but I mean, I think that there is green interest there. Apparently, for the moment, there is no interest in doing that in Moscow. But maybe there is some interest, at least on the military side of the Russian part, to discuss confidence-building measures in terms of communications, at least. Finally, just an observation on the question of small weapons that you said. I think, yes, the case of the Balkans is very clear. We in Italy, we had the same problem after the end of the war. And catches of weapons still remain in Italy. And we have, and so from time to time are discovered. Not very efficient, but that's the way. But this is more a question, seems to me, of, let's say, law and order, of working of the state, of a state which functions and applies the law more than an international. Well, an international question could be useful, but it's not really a question of arms control, in my opinion. Even if the traffic of small arms is certainly something that should be considered. Thank you.
Points. One, during the course of this discussion, I hardly heard the word Budapest Memorandum. So I was wondering, especially ask Paulina to see what is really the position of Ukraine on this arrangement. It's not a treaty, clearly, but one which, strangely enough, Lavrov, who was at the time permanent representative to the UN, asked the Secretary General, with all his colleagues as well, to make it an official document of the Security Council and of the General Assembly of the UN. So it has a certain legal status, let's say. And the second question goes to Dr. Schmidt. He mentioned the Florence Agreement on, if I recall well, it was on Serbia, Bosnia-Herzegovina, within the framework of the Dayton Agreement. So indeed, this is an interesting precedent, but of course it was within the framework already of a peace agreement, which was basically handed by the United States. It's not a coincidence that it took place in Dayton, Ohio. Thank you. We have a certain, in Italy we have a certain responsibility because it took place in Florence, as you know.
Okay, well, we have a second round of questions. Great.
It's Natalino Ronzetti. The first question is to Professor Polina and in part also to Dr. Schmidt. Is the problem of recovery of your territory from Russia, supposing that you are successful, what is the future of Ukraine? I see there are two problems. One is a domestic problem and is the status of minorities. You can rely on the treaties of Council of Europe. There are a couple of treaties, and also you can rely on the practice of European states. Mainly there is the status of South Tyrol or Alto Adige for Italy with the Austrian minority. The second problem is the status of Ukraine after the peace or armistice. I don't know what kind of instrument you have in mind. Is a status of permanent neutrality will be, or you insist in your adhesion to NATO? Permanent neutrality can, of course, can be consonant or conform to the European Union, because there are at least two countries which have a permanent neutrality in the European Union, Austria and Malta, and they still are part of the European Union. But of course, permanent neutrality is not compatible with NATO. So the question is that if you want a status of permanent neutrality or not, and if you choose this kind of a status of permanent neutrality, which guarantee you will ask for non-aggression by the other states and for the protection by the other states toward you. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the contributions by all panelists. And I have to say that I was particularly encouraged by the reference that Niels made to the fact that the provision of weapons can actually contribute to peace by improving the negotiating position of Ukraine, particularly given that it has come as a bit of a surprise for the peace community. The fact that the peace facility that the EU had actually foreseen in order to support peace efforts has seen most of its funds being used for the purchase and delivery of weapons. So this is, of course, this is fine, but I mean, I think that we also need to sort of find a justification as to why this is okay and under which conditions it should be employed in future, because obviously it is creating a precedent, and there is still a bit of a contradiction between calling it peace facility and then using it actually for the delivery of military equipment. So this said, I actually have a question to put on the table for the whole panel. And basically, it's about, it is motivated by the desire to be both provocative and also optimistic. So in conversation with mediators, with UN mediators who have received a mandate by the UN Secretary General to mediate in conflicts, it's something that they have highlighted quite a bit is that for mediation to be successful, you actually need two parties, two sides to a conflict that do not have a perspective of winning. So when none of the parties can win, then there is a role for mediation. So something interesting about the paper of Mr. Schmidt is that he actually highlights, actually the parties cannot win. Well, Russia cannot win because as long as there is Western support to Ukraine, this possibility of winning is not there. Now, on the Ukrainian side, you are, of course, also suffering a lot of loss of manpower, so that, I mean, aren't we approximating that point of maturity, which would make it possible to launch as a mediation with better prospects than what was originally attempted by Turkey? Because if it is true that you actually need this combination, then we might actually be reaching the point where some mediation can be put on the table. And then my second question, and this is more of a genuine question, is what sort of arms control agreement or arrangement could be contemplated? Because, I mean, we have already heard from the other interventions, apart from your own interventions, that the prospects do not look great. But I was wondering if as part of the peace settlement, once some sort of deal has been penciled, there could be some element of conventional arms control, precisely in order to reassure both sides and also external powers that there isn't going to be a continued militia, low-intensity war fighting, dragging on and on and on without actually seeing an end to the conflict. While perhaps as far as nuclear arms control is concerned, this is something that shouldn't be part of that agreement. It could be launched beforehand, like completely separately from it, or perhaps wait for a later point in time. So I wonder what are your thoughts on this, on the possible connection or disconnection of any arms control arrangements if there was a possibility that they could prosper. Thank you.
Many thanks for the additional questions. I think that there are no more questions in the room. No? Great. So we are going to go first with the replies from the discussants, first with Niels, then Paulina, and finally with your own concluding remarks and replies, Dr. Schmidt, if it's all right with you. Because also I see that we have one online question that it's specifically addressed to Mr. Duque, to Niels. So Niels, the floor is yours for the replies.
No, thank you very much for the various questions. I'm going to try to answer them in one response. I think that's maybe a bit easier. Also, the question online is really specifically about what legal and political measures can be taken to try to avoid diversion. But let me start first with a more fundamental question. Is trying to fight the proliferation of small arms and light weapons, is it only law and order, or is it international approach? Of course, you need to have a law and order approach to do so. but because of the risks involved with the diversion of such weapons, the proliferation of such weapons, not only in Ukraine but also abroad, it becomes part of an international strategy. And it becomes part of arms control. And often this is forgotten, and that's why I wanted to highlight this here. But you can see that very clearly when you look, for example, at the 2016 EU global strategy. Fighting small arms and light weapons proliferation is one key aspect of that. If you look at the mandate of the OSCE, fighting small arms and light weapons proliferation is one of them. So we should not forget about that. This is a bit, but then it becomes tricky. And I think it becomes tricky because of the EU institutional framework. How do you fight that? Because, for example, when we talk about arms deliveries, we always talk about European arms deliveries. Well, in fact, they're not European arms deliveries. They're national arms deliveries from EU member states. This is a national competence. So it becomes tricky already. And then we've seen some evolutions towards a more, let's say, harmonized EU approach there, and I think the European Peace Facility is one of them. And I share the irony from a previous question. But the European Peace Facility was established to prevent conflict by supporting military and defense capabilities of other countries. So the fact that they are using it to send weapons or financing weapons streams is not a surprise. We knew this was coming, but nobody expected it to become so big, so quickly, so focused on Ukraine immediately. What is important to keep in mind is that, of course, Europe can also support peace by other means than only military and defense capabilities. And this is, of course, a bit of the risk that now we're only focusing on the weapons issue, while I think in reality there are many more things what you can do to have a more durable peace. I'm quite an optimist. Even in dark days, I try to stay positive. I try to look for the positive signs. What does that mean? For a long time, the EU did not take up a role in arms export controls and arms deliveries. It didn't take up that role. It was up to the member states with various negative consequences. Now, with the European peace facilities, we actually see steps being taken for a more European control system that moves into the direction of post-shipment controls. This is something that we have been advocating for quite a long time. Make sure to limit risk of diversion by having post-shipment controls. Once you have shipped them, you should be able to have control of them. Now, for the very first time, this is actually happening with the national arms deliveries funded by the European Peace Facility. The criteria to do so is actually the fact that you have an agreement with Ukraine on these weapons, on the possibility of having post-shipment controls next year and in 2 years, and all kinds of agreements about transferring these weapons between various units. So there are, for the first time, these types of commitments. And I hope that this is something that we can learn from and we can also adopt in other post-conflict situations. If we're going to send weapons to Mali or other types, you can also have the same framework that you can apply for. This was not possible before. The second thing, this is of course very important also as a security strategy. This is, again, the European institutional framework is a bit difficult, but it's on the one hand, it's the EU external policy. On the other hand, it's the internal security policy. And there, I think we're seeing a movement towards each other. And there, I think for us, crucial, what can we do, what can we learn, is learn from the mistakes we might have made in former Yugoslavia, where we waited too long, where we had too much of an EU approach. I think what is very important for us is to listen to and to observe the situation in Ukraine itself, once the conflict is done, and make those weapons, first of all, more visible. Don't try to take them back. You will not be successful. You will not be successful if you organize an amnesty in the year after the ceasefire, but make them visible. Make sure you allow people to possess these weapons for self-protection, but make them visible. Because if you make them visible, the risk of diversion becomes much smaller. So we should try to listen carefully to what the situation is. And then a very important step, and that's what I'm going to end with, is try to keep cooperating with Ukraine. Efforts had been made before 2022 to set up the cooperation on law enforcement between EU member states, Europol, Ukraine, and so on. We should make that a priority in the days after, and not just focus on the military aspect, but also focus on the law and order aspect as part of our European international policy.
Okay. So thank you very much for such a great number of questions. I would try to address the ones which were mostly directed to me, because there are some questions which also Dr. Schmidt would answer, and I just don't want to take most part of the time. So the first question was by Ettore. Is it possible? I mean, of course, in the beginning of the war, the position of our president was much more flexible because he didn't feel, I mean, he didn't know about that amount of support which Ukraine would gain. So the main idea was to retain Ukraine because the main threat was that Ukraine will just disappear under the Russian troops and there won't be Ukraine at all. So he was quite flexible. And as far as he felt that there is a support from the West, as far as he understood that we have a good trained army and which can resist, which can fight. So the position had become much less flexible, plus all these atrocities which Russia has done against Ukrainian cities, the situation with Bucha, Irpin, Mariupol, it never, you know, increases the flexibility and the eagerness to negotiate because, you know, everyone understands that they should pay the price for what they have done. So that is why in the beginning, of course, when Russia hasn't taken the 20% of our territory, when Russia hasn't done all it done, it was still possible to say, okay, let's go back to the initial positions and let's, you know, forget it. Now it's not possible. The more we are contributing to the war, the more we are losing, the less we are willing to say, let's come back and forget about this, because it's unforgettable, which was paid already for this war. This is just, you know, how life affects the position, and I don't think that now feeling that support from the West and the fact that, you know, the initial position of the West regarding the weapon supplies, it has shifted significantly during the last year. Zelensky understands that we can have more, we can gain more, we can take more, and we can pressure more. That is why should he be flexible? He, on the other, plus again, Russia never showed the real willingness to negotiate. Putin never negotiated with Zelensky. Putin was always neglecting this possibility and always behaved in the way that Ukraine is guilty in something. In what, I mean, it was like absolutely ridiculous allegations about something which had never happened. That is why I don't think that it's can be possible again. This flexibility of position of which was in the spring of the last year. Again, speaking about, yeah, there was a very nice question about the problems related to Ukraine, which as a Ukrainian, can't ignore completely. I mean, can't ignore at all. First, the status of minorities in Ukraine. I think, you know, it's a mildly speaking, there is no problem of minorities in Ukraine. I'm from Odessa. I'm a Russian language speaking person from Odessa, which still speaks Russian and which was giving lectures in my university in Russian language and never opposed by anyone. I have started giving lectures in Ukrainian only since this year because it was the reaction on the Russian aggression. You know, having changed my own position to completely different, not because I was suppressed by Ukraine, but because Russians made me to change my position, at least officially. Of course, in my daily life, I am not going to transfer in Ukrainian because it's my second language. And between all my friends, we communicate Russian. And if you come to Odessa, you will never, I mean, hear Ukrainian at the street because all people speak Russian. So what's the problem of Russian minorities? My question is, what is the problem of Russian minorities? This is the Putin's propaganda, and this is absolutely disgusting, I'm telling you. Because, you know, I know it better from my own experience. There is no problem. This is something which is coming from the Russian TV, always keep coming, and only people who are, you know, raised on the Russian TV, there can be some people in Ukraine, there can be some people in Russian, there can be some people in the trams who are persuaded that, you know, that you will be forbidden to speak Russian. Moreover, I have a variety of students as I'm teaching at the university. I have people who belong even to private sector, which is presented as something very terrible and aggressive and so on and so forth, and which is now a part of our military forces. So I have a PhD student who was the representative of private sector in the south of Ukraine. He never speaks Ukrainian to me. He's always speaking Russian. He's always speaking Russian to his family and friends. I mean, of course, maybe he speaks Ukrainian at work, but I mean, there is no problem of minorities. I don't know what minorities experience the problem, except those who are presented in the Russian TV. The second aspect of this is the status of Ukraine after the war. I think that the question of neutrality is not an issue anymore, because under Yanukovych we have adopted the neutrality status, and what we had at the end, that Russia does not understand the meaning of neutrality. So for Russia, when Ukraine is neutral, is like for the guy when the girl is single. It's not the issue, because Russia does not recognize Ukraine as a separate state. They believe Ukraine belongs to them. This is why neutrality of Ukraine is a sort of, teasing and giving them permanent temptation to take it more. Because before, why this Orange Revolution, not Orange Revolution, the Revolution of Dignity in 2014, Maidan, happened? Because Russia just forbidden Yanukovych to keep on the consistent strategy about joining writing the association agreement with EU. But Ukraine was neutral officially. However, it could not be neutral because Russia kept on dictating its rules. It wanted Ukraine back to its influence, maybe not formally, but de facto. This is why I don't think that, and again, Budapest Memorandum, Ukraine took a very, very strong lesson from this. Because, when Ukraine signed Budapest Memorandum, there was a total belief that this is the best mechanism how we can regulate conflict. And before 2012, in our military strategy, there was no meaning of deterrence, conventional anything. There was the idea that in case if conflict erupts, our main mechanism is referring to the UN Security Council, to our guarantors on the Budapest Memorandum to settle down the issue. So we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have deterrence, we didn't have good army, and that's what we have now. So for us now, there is no guarantees. There are no assurances because Budapest Memorandum didn't provide any guarantees. There is no assurances except guarantees, and the only guarantees which can be given are guarantees from NATO, because we don't have any other alliances viable. This is why I don't think that neutrality accepts developing some kind of new format when, I don't know, NATO would give Ukraine separate guarantees of defending it in case if Russia attacks is possible, because we know that Russia neglects any treaties, because of course Russia neglected Budapest Memorandum, but it was not a treaty. But Russia has neglected many other treaties with Ukraine. It was a big Russian-Ukrainian treaty, which was about, respecting each other's borders and so on and so forth. Russia just, destroyed it. So Russia is not respecting treaties as it is, and it's not only about memorandum. This is why nobody trusts Russia. There is a biggest distrust in anything which Russia can promise for tomorrow. This is why I don't think that Ukraine will ever regard any other option, if it can, except of becoming a part of the transatlantic alliance, with any perspective, but the neutrality is just not an option because Russia will never respect it. On paper maybe for some time, but then it will be threat again. As for the possibility, Clara's question about the possibility of mediation, I don't think, now it's really hardly possible. I'm not expert in, mediation or conflict studies, But I can refer to my colleague, who is one of the most serious Ukrainian experts in conflict resolution and conflict studies, the professor from Kyiv University. So this year we had some kind of meeting of the research groups which was organized by IFSH in Germany, and they tried to make some negotiation, just like preliminary, of Ukrainian, Russian experts, and then to see how it would work, maybe what conclusions we can reach in this common discussion. So this professor from Kyiv University said, I don't really see the rationale for this, because nobody is ready for mediation, negotiation, anything. There is no even 0 or like 1% readiness from any of the side to negotiate and to settle down the conflict. And since there is none of it, there is no point of discussing the future configuration of the system, because for now, everyone is still very much determined to win, to gain maximum results. I don't know, maybe Russia has already gave up the idea of taking over Kiev, but some signs show that not completely. So I think that Russia is waiting for the better times of 2024, when the US will possibly diminish the support if Democrats will change to Republicans. And Ukraine is waiting for more ammunition and arms to fight Russia finally, to throw Russia away from Ukrainian land. And that is why each side is very much determined to fight now. This is why, unfortunately, maybe when both sides would be exhausted, but, again, this is either Russia or Ukraine. There's still no obvious, visible future for this, as my point of view. Thank you. I think I took too much time.
I was going to ask to be a little bit brief with the final comments and conclusions, because we are a little bit out of time. Yeah, sorry for this.
Thank you. Well, to keep it short, I will start with the Florence Agreement. You are right in your description. I fully agree with that. But the Florence Agreement had the contact group to govern the whole process. And this is something which could be used again, for example, to steering also some kind of armistice or ceasefire agreement between the Ukraine and Russia. And the question is, who should participate in such a contact group, because Russia should not. No question about it. It was in the Dayton Peace Agreement, it was Russia, the fourth part in the group, yes. So that about the Florence Agreement. With that, I will come to your remark that we must wait for the outcome of the war in discussing elements of a possible ceasefire agreement. I would not agree on that. We should look to the experience of past agreements and look which instruments could be worthwhile, help us to stabilize it. Well, in the end, it depends on both sides how far they are willing to use them and how far we contribute to that and bring in our expertise and our power and so on in a peace agreement. And of course, it will be not only a peace agreement, a ceasefire agreement between Russia and Ukraine. Other parties will be involved. Otherwise, there will be no stable agreement. So, saying that, I was also asked about status of minorities. Well, when I look to the minorities in the Ukraine, in particular Russian minorities, how they are happy with it, with the attack and the aggression. Are they still minorities in the Russian view, or have they changed more towards the Ukraine? So what is really the status of minorities after the war? This is something which should be discussed when we should look for regulations of minorities, and I would agree with you that there should be regulations for minorities, no question about it. But this plays also into it. Well, the status of neutrality and NATO. Well, my guess is the longer we see a war, the less likelihood that the Ukraine will adopt neutrality, with one exception. If the Ukraine would lose a lot of territorium, neutrality could be an instrument to preserve at least some kind of sovereignty. But I don't, this would be the difference here. And, well, the guarantee for protection, I think, is very important, not only for the Ukraine, but also for the Russians, because the first time the Minsk agreement, or the first Minsk agreement, was headed by the Ukraine forces and right-wing forces, which attacked Russian forces, and the mediators were not able, or not willing, both, I think, worked at that time, to stop it, and looked then for the Minsk II agreement. So Russia has also some demands in that regard, and therefore I think it's very difficult. And what I also want to say, currently we face the problem either putting a lot of weapons into the Ukraine that they accept a ceasefire, or we offer them NATO membership. NATO membership would have the advantage that we can reduce the demand of forces and the demand of weapon systems. This could be also something which could be to the advantage of Russia, but Russia must accept it. And currently, I think they would not accept it. But it's something which should be discussed in the future from my point of view. This comes also to your question. Some elements of conventional arms control after a ceasefire. Well, I wish it also, but I don't know how far it can be realized. The reason is, as long as Russia will not give up its current expansionistic approach, it would be very difficult to establish European-wide arms control, or at least regional arms control, to stabilize the situation in the Ukraine and around the Ukraine. This needs also something Russia must do. With that, I will come to my last point. I thank you very much, both of you. I think the 3 points you mentioned, with most I agree. I'm not so hopefully that the compromise solution will have arms control as you, but it needs to be further discussed, no question about it. And I also fully agree with you that the delivery of weapons can be used as an instrument for steering a peace process, or at least coming to a ceasefire. And I also fully agree, and I will introduce in my paper, that we should look after the war what will happen with the weapons we deliver. And a better control of that is surely what I would support, no question about it. With that, I will come to you. Well, I welcome very much your support of my idea with the 3 scenarios or options. I must come back to my list. I had some points, but we can also bilaterally discuss because we run out of time. I think there was, what I like very much was that you defined the point where Putin could lose the war. This is really helpful. And many you said about the war and the conditions, well, I see in a similar way. And I see also the problem of mutual dissatisfaction about a compromise. This is a major challenge, how we can introduce or install a ceasefire agreement which really prevent the next war.
Thank you very much to all to the speaker and to both discussants. So now we will proceed to the closing remarks by Deputy Director General Alessandro Azzoni. Please, you can take the stage. Many thanks.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. Thanks to Yai for inviting me here. And I'm sorry, I will say something a lot less interesting than what I heard with just in the few minutes that I'm here. But you know, we are diplomats. We are forced to deal with the reality that we have, and which is very, very unfortunate. But so I will not be able to say something anything new and amazing and wow, what is that? But of course, we have to take stock of what's happening. The return of war to Europe has boosted an already ongoing process of deep transformation in European security architecture that was already ongoing. I'm sorry, just a personal footnote. I've been many things, as all diplomats, and we change life every 4 years, but I was permanent representative to the OSCE for 4 years, between 2016 and 2020. So I followed the whole involution of the structure of the special monitoring mission there, been to Kyiv many times, been to Donbass many times. So I mean, a part of my heart is buried there somewhere. But let's talk about what we have and what we could have in the future. Even if I'm very worried about any time when a diplomat is asked to be a prophet, because normally it doesn't work. On the NATO side, the aggression by Russia has had a deep impact on NATO's deterrence and defense posture. The alliance was more united and cohesive than ever since the end of the Cold War, and even sometimes before, if I may. I'm talking about the Euro missiles, Euro whatever. All 30 agreed and contributed at very short notice to extraordinary immediate measures to signal to Moscow our resolve, and something I think the Russian leadership did not expect. Not so much, I would say. Emergency planning and deployments have been activated and finalized within hours since the first Russian tank crossed the international border. Furthermore, on a structural level, NATO has adjusted its military posture along the eastern flank, reinforcing our enhanced forward presence in Poland and the Baltics, establishing a similar structure in Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, and Hungary, strengthening our vigilance activities in land and air, sea, and the cyberspace. Equally important has been the non-lethal support to Ukraine decided by NATO through the so-called Comprehensive Assistance Package, a fund which provided and is providing Kyiv with much-needed items to sustain the resistance effort. What about the EU? The EU has undertaken 3 main measures to counter the aggression: military support, financial aid, and restrictive measures such as sanctions. Sanctions is, I have my ideas. Again, going back to my personal past, I was head of the Common Foreign Security Policy for 4 years before going to the OSCE in Vienna. So I have my ideas about sanctions. Sanctions are a good thing, but they must be intended as what they are, a tool to achieve something, not an achievement in themselves. Sometimes in Brussels, we tend to be so happy about what we're doing with sanctions that we think that sanctions are an achievement in themselves. We're so happy, 10th package of sanctions. No, sanctions must be always measured and vis-a-vis reality. But then they are part of a multi-dimensional approach, and the very first package of sanctions was adopted in February, and we are now at the 10th. So a lot has been done, and also a lot has been lost, because we must be sure about it. I mean, sanctions have a cost. The cost should be higher for the others, for the bad guys, but they have a cost also for us, for the good guys, or what we think we are. Indeed, I think that in Europe we realize that we are at a unique stage in our history, and that the time has come to undertake a number of commitments through the so-called strategic compass in order to reinforce the EU role as a global security provider. We're doing a lot Also, as far as the so-called European defense and technology industrial base is concerned, and I think we're going to the right direction. It's a slow path, but then we have my old battleground, the OSCE. Well, as you know, the OSCE works by consensus, which means that now it's blocked. Maybe dead, but don't quote me. Not dead, really, because, I mean, of course, it was blocked by the fact that that there was a split between Russia and the rest, more or less, or not the whole rest, unfortunately, but we don't have in the OSCE unified budget. We didn't have in 2022. We don't have a unified budget in 2023. We don't have a chairmanship for 2024. We have the three top charges of the OSCE expiring next summer, and I think it will be very hard to find new names to agree upon. But there is a resilience within the OSCE. Unable to rely on the regular budget to implement most of its activities, the organization made an extensive use of extra budgetary projects to maintain its operation, particularly in the human dimension. In Ukraine, for example, the OSCE has launched a support program funded entirely by voluntary contributions to replace, of course, the monitoring mission, which lasted 1 minute after the aggression, more or less. Going to arms control and disarmament. I mean, arms control and disarmament is a political process that reflects the current state of mutual relations. In a nutshell, events, dear boy, events. That's the main driving force behind foreign policy, I mean, events. So when Putin announced on February 21 he was suspending the participation of Russia in the New START Treaty, which was the last remaining pact that regulates the world's two largest nuclear arsenals, no one was caught by surprise. No one can pretend, oh, wow, what did he do? Of course it was like that. Last November, the Russians unilaterally decided at the very last moment, without providing credible explanation, not to attend the Cairo meeting, which was meant to discuss resuming inspections under the New START Treaty. There will be no data exchanges, at least on Russia's part. The work of the Bilateral Commission will be suspended. On-site inspection will stop. At the same time, at least according to the foreign ministry statement, Russia has promised to respect the quantitative limits, but it's a promise. Well, before the suspension of New START, in April 2022, the dialogue between Moscow and Washington on strategic stability had been frozen by the Russian, who also said that those contacts could be resumed once Russia completed its special military operation in Ukraine. I mean, all this indicates that, contrary to what happened during the Cold War, Russia does not wish to separate arms control from the current geopolitical realities. As the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said, Russia does not intend to discuss New START while Washington continues arming Ukraine, which is something that didn't happen during the Cold War from this point of view. This is where we stand now. I mean, most likely a protracted suspension of the verification, inspection, and meetings of the Bilateral Consultative Commission will increase mutual distrust, will make it more difficult to identify and agree upon the necessary adjustment to be finalized in view of the extension of the treaty beyond 2026. Without the extension and without a new treaty, for the first time since 1972, there will be no limitation on the US and Russian nuclear arsenals. A new nuclear arms race would be more likely, and I guess we can all agree on how dangerous this could prove for global stability and security. On our side, we can only hope that Russia will quickly realize it has lost a tool through which it could show the rest of the world that it keeps its promises on strategic arms limitation. That tool is now gone and forever, and accusations against Russia are already coming. Russia will not be able to respond credibly. I think, honestly, and I don't play on abused quotation, but I think that the Russian leadership did not properly consider this decision to suspend the treaty. I think it was a mistake, something worse than a crime. Yeah? So where can we go from here? I don't know. As I said, diplomats are no prophet, and don't believe any diplomat pretending that he knows where to go. from where we are now, NATO has proved extremely clear-eyed and sober in the steps it has taken, avoiding misperception and escalatory moves. Sure, not in the light of the Russian aggression, NATO has approved last June its new strategic concept and is currently working on its implementation in view of the upcoming summit in Vilnius. The allied military posture and planning that will emerge from this process will clearly reflect the deteriorated geostrategic picture. In addition to that, NATO membership is on the verge of include Finland and Sweden. Bottom line, in my view, is that NATO is and will be stronger and more united than before. And footnote here on neutrality. I think it's a dream talking about neutrality, and not only because Sweden and Finland abandoned neutrality. I reveal no secret. We're having security discussions with Switzerland. So neutrality now is something that can work only in the UN General Assembly, and I tell you, it will work less and less. Because what happened a few weeks ago, 141 votes against 7, but with the 32 plus 20 something abstaining, I think the room for these abstentions is getting narrow and narrow, in my view. But that's, again, the diplomat playing the prophet, which is, makes no sense. On the EU side, the full implementation of the strategic compass within the established deadlines will likely determine the credibility of the EU as a global security provider and partner for many years to come. This is a question mark that I have, having worked within the common foreign security policy environment. Any backtracking or failure to deliver would reflect badly on the EU reputation and on the EU ability to sustain the growing strategic competition. As Italy, we believe that the EU has a crucial role to play in this new global security environment, and that we should act and develop our action as a EU in full complementarity with NATO. Again, the OSCE, I don't want to talk too much, but now it's in a kind of a coma status. That's pretty clear. I don't want to dwell it on. I mean, I will shorten my intervention on this. But I think that the OSCE could provide, in a changed environment, as a good platform to start again. Because in its almost 50 years, the OSCE has developed a sort of a key in the whole three dimension of its activities, and this is still a valuable asset. Field missions, ODIHR, and a broader concept of security. I mean, these are still the foundation for a potential new Helsinki. It's not there, it's not in the foreseeable future, but it could be in a way beyond the horizon. I mean, let's be frank, in more general terms, looking at the current state of international relations, one might infer that resuming a cooperative security framework would be virtually impossible. However, we are convinced that pursuing arms control and non-proliferation efforts in order to safeguard global security and stability remains an indispensable goal in spite of the present circumstances and notwithstanding some misgivings even of some of our allies. The challenge is to preserve the existing architecture, however deteriorated it is, so it can continue to fulfill its functions in contributing to global and European security. We cannot create anything new in this moment. So if we throw what we have and what we built in the last 50, 60 years away, we will have nothing. We won't have something better. We will have nothing. True, the aggression on Ukraine is a watershed event with far-reaching systemic repercussions. The change in the paradigm of collective security in Europe, the renewed compactness of the Euro-Atlantic community, the start of the process of reducing dependence on Russian energy supplies are factors that, together with others, have determined a deep redefinition of our relations with Moscow. It's Lavrov who said that. We will never rely on a Western country partner anymore. He said that. So on what will he rely? On China? Anyway, like it or not, and beyond any rhetoric, however, I mean, even just rhetoric, the Russian Federation, whatever the outcome of the ongoing conflict, will continue to be a variable of the equation that regulates the function of our continent. We cannot pretend that Russia will disappear. Even in a very likely open confrontation, such as during the Cold War, or even worse from some points of view, the system should provide for mechanisms that minimize the risk of conflict and ensure the stability necessary for the economic and social development of Europe. This past year has seen tremendous suffering and devastation in the heart of Europe, as well as growing divide between superpowers and also medium powers. I am thankful to the Istituto Affari Internazionali for the opportunity to exchange views on these topics, which are increasingly relevant not just for researchers and students, but also for ordinary people. I mean, when we hear the news about the Zaporizhia area, we should all be not frightened, terrified. On our part, we look forward to having more occasion of interaction. I mean, those who know me, been knowing me for many years, know how much I believe in interaction between diplomacy, practitioners, and academia and think tanks. I think it's crucial at all levels, because we cannot be prophet, but we would like very much of it. We cannot be prophet, but you can. So you can set we're good in keeping direction, but we're not very good in finding the direction. So, but what we can keep, we can keep it. But we need help on the other. Kofi Annan spoke of transnational problems without passports, which threaten global peace, health, and prosperity, and require international cooperation to be resolved. I think that this is the bottom line: strengthening international cooperation. Italy can play an important role, in our view, in bridging the widening gap between nation and disarmament, on disarmament and non-proliferation issues. Last night, the presidency of the IAEA General Conference and of the BWC Review Conference have successfully demonstrated how our approach to international relations, based on dialogue, mutual respect, and without strong vested interests, can contribute to diffusing tensions and achieving compromise. Hopefully, with your support, we can continue on this path. Thank you for your attention and your time. I hope I haven't been too long. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for your words, Ambassador. And well, let's go to it. The meeting is over. You have a light buffet lunch behind you. Thanks for all of you to be here.